Our interpreters are still on strike when it comes to remote participation. We do have remote participation today, but our experts will talk in English, and you can, of course, being in the room, talk all your languages. If there are no comments, the agenda can be adopted, and because of the time constraints, we'll come back on the announcements at a later stage, either at the end of this morning or at the end of this afternoon. Let me immediately jump to point number 4, which is the exchange of views with the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC, and the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, HERA, on the COVID-19 pandemic. And I first want to welcome Mr. Pierre Delceau, who is next to me, and Mrs. Andrea Amon, Director of the European Centre for Disease, who is, I hope, online. Let me make a very short introduction because we have a very specific task today. Both ACDC and HERA will come back to this committee when we have in-depth other questions. But yet today, and I think we see it in all our member states, we are confronted with a new wave. We see that people get infected and there's an increase of infection, and that we're far away from achieving herd immunity. And it seems like Omicron is evading the immune protection that we've built up with vaccination and previous COVID infections. And this means that we again are faced with important dilemmas today. For instance, today, what resources do we want to continue to dedicate to the battle against COVID-19? We managed during the crisis, based on a lot of volunteers, but also the very courageous medical staff, to run the testing centres, the vaccination centres, and special COVID hospital wards. It was an extraordinary effort without precedents, but today all of these efforts have been scaled back, which is of course normal, but maybe to a level that we're not yet prepared for this wave that we're facing. So the question is, what level of preparedness do we need today? To Mrs. Hamon from ACDC, we want us to discuss what we know about the current wave and what we can predict for the autumn. And we also want to hear more about ACDC's recommendation to EU member states to prepare for the autumn. And next we will talk about the EU vaccination strategy. Mr. Delceau, the vaccines we have today are not as effective against infection as they were a year ago. And the question is how to deal with that. The US has communicated that they will not ask for new clinical trials for the Omicron-adapted vaccines, and that they will only adopt vaccines that specifically target BA4 and BA5. And I think the EU will choose a slightly different strategy, but I think it's up to our both experts from HERA and ACDC to explain how to deal with that. Let me now go first to Mrs. Andrea Amon, Director of ACDC, for 7 minutes for their opening statement, and right after I give the floor to Mr. Pierre Delceau also for 7 minutes. And again, just to be able that everybody can intervene, I ask to stick more or less to that timing. Mrs. Amon, can we get you on the screen, please? Yes, there you are. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me this morning, and a very good morning to all of you. I will try to answer the question and the raised to me in 7 minutes, but please, if I don't touch on certain elements that you are interested in, raise them in your questions. I will start immediately with the current epidemiological what it may herald for the public health measures that are necessary now. We have seen an increase in the past 3 weeks, an increase in in case notification rates and as well as an increasing trend in hospitalizations. And in several EU EEA countries, and we project that by the end of this month, the BA.5 sublineage will be the dominant variant in most of the EU countries. So what we are seeing right now signals for us the start of a new widespread COVID-19 wave across the European Union, potentially similarly to what Portugal has seen earlier this year. So there is really no doubt that the pandemic isn't over yet, and that there is really no time for complacency, because there are still many individuals at risk for severe COVID disease or infection whom we need to protect as soon as possible. And that is I want to also remind all of us still the goal for all the vaccination efforts to avoid severe disease and deaths. And what we have been seeing so far is that the current vaccines are still effective against severe disease. This is why the Medicines Agency and ECDC have issued a joint statement at the beginning of this week, where we advise, based on the modeling data that we see now, that adults 60 years and older and the medically vulnerable population that are at risk for severe disease get a second booster doses with the current available vaccines now, so that we can avert a significant number of hospitalization and deaths from COVID-19. And that is particularly relevant for those countries where the BA.5 wave is now starting or in the increasing phase. Now, we have seen that many countries have been preparing for vaccine campaigns a bit later, in September or later, but so it will require some efforts to achieve now an immediate campaign. But it's now is the time to make this effort, because by September we assume that most countries are at the peak or already over the peak, and then the impact of such a booster is less big. So regarding the autumn, here it will really depend on the final decision. What will be the outcome of the negotiations and discussions that are taking place? But what we believe is that later in the year, a booster with updated vaccines may be necessary for the population at risk, at least. So the current data don't show that people below 60 and without being at risk for severe disease, there is no advantage of getting a booster now. I want to also come back to the general, looking back at the past 2 years, where we have a significant number of lessons that we have learned. Many of these lessons have been actually put into the legal proposal to amend our mandate, and part of this is in particular the strengthening of the preparedness, and the upgrading of the surveillance systems for future crises. Now, the chair has already said that the investments and resources put into the pandemic are scaled back. I just want to make a point here saying that in order to achieve all these preparedness improvements and digitalization of surveillance, there will be significant investments and prioritization of resources for public health necessary. Lastly, I want to say that we don't know yet what will be the situation, epidemiological situation in the fall, which is the variant that will be circulating. So we think it is very important that countries also are prepared now to a systematic, sustainable surveillance for not only for COVID, but also for other respiratory diseases. First of all, of course, influenza. And this is why next week, beginning of next week on Monday, we will come out with 2 guidance documents for the fall for member states for the surveillance, which is an integrated respiratory surveillance for member states together with WHO, and on considerations for the vaccination in the fall. I leave it at that, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Amon. I'm quite sure there will be a lot of questions. We'll come back to that. I first now give gladly the floor to Mr. Delso from HERA, please. You have the floor, 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Good morning to everybody, and thanks for inviting HERA to this committee. I'm not going to dwell too much on the whole of HERA because, as you say, I will be invited again. I hope so. I hope so. I will see what the outcome of this meeting is, but anyway. So thank you very much. First of all, the first message I would like to convey to everybody, and that's following what Andrea has said. The current vaccine, as you say, is not maybe as effective against as Omicron, but still it's very effective. So the current vaccines are still good, and protect still people. So if you want to be vaccinated now, you will get a good vaccine. And we should be proud of what has been achieved with the vaccine because, you might have seen the figures were saying that actually 20 million of people have avoided to die thanks of the vaccine globally, of course, not only in Europe, but 20 million of people have been saved because of the vaccination strategy. So it's a collective effort, but that's something which we should all be proud of. Now, looking at, after the summer, as Andrea has said, we see a surge of cases now. Very likely there will be a new surge of cases after the summer. And we don't know, of course, which variant it will be. We have to monitor the situation. For the moment, as you know, BA4, BA4 are dominant, but maybe we might have another one. I don't want to threaten you, just to frighten you. It's simply that's a possibility that we don't know. The good news is that we have enough vaccines to vaccinate the European population. And that's something which is still possible under the current vaccines. Sorry? You don't hear me, or? No, okay. And
it's okay.
No, sorry. We have enough vaccines to vaccinate the population and also to share, like we have done in the past, with the rest of the world if they want to get access to those vaccines. So where are we now? And let me be very concrete and very practical because I believe this is the purpose of this committee. So let's go to the different contracts. First, as you know, we have a contract with BioNTech Pfizer, which is still valid for the current of this year. We have concluded amendment to this contract with BioNTech Pfizer just to stop the deliveries which were supposed to arrive in quarter 2 and quarter 3. So in other words, today, member states have stopped receiving these vaccines. Why? Simply because they have enough of the current vaccine in their stocks. So they don't need to receive more, actually, because actually it's more a problem of keeping them somewhere in the warehouse. So we have stopped the deliveries of those vaccines now to the member states simply because they don't need it. And I will come back to what will happen to those vaccines. Actually, those quantities which should have been delivered in quarter 2 and quarter 3 will be delivered after the summer. and I will come back to that issue. So in other words, we have postponed the delivery from now to after the summer to have more vaccines being delivered when unfortunately, we fear that there will be a new surge of COVID cases. That's the first element. With Moderna, we have done the same thing for Q2. So in other words, we have also been able to stop the deliveries of Moderna vaccines for Q2 and postpone them to after the summer. For deliveries which are supposed to arrive now in Q3, we are still in negotiation and discussions with Moderna. But we hope to find an agreement very quickly on that aspect. We still have 2 other vaccines which are not yet authorized but which could be interesting. One of them is from Sanofi, but they have not yet been approved by EMA. And the second one is from a Spanish company which is called Hipra. You might have heard about them, which has also vaccines which needs to be approved by EMA very likely after the summer. But we are also have the possibility, member states have also the possibility to purchase and to get access to those vaccines if needed. Now, so as I told you, we have stopped the delivery of the current vaccines, and those deliveries will come after the summer. And the key important element for you to know that those deliveries which will come after the summer will be offered with an adapted vaccines. As you know, both companies, BioNTech, Pfizer, the 3 companies, BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna, are working on an adapted vaccines. And so the idea is that the only vaccines that the EU will continue to receive after the summer will be an adapted vaccines. Now, the question, of course, for you, and it's a very important one, will be, and you mentioned it in your introduction, Chair, is what kind of adapted vaccine? What kind of adapted vaccines are we going to receive? As you may know, companies, both the 3 companies, have first been working on a bivalent vaccines, which would combine the original strain and Omicron BA.1. Why Omicron BA.1? Because at the time when they were making the development, it was the most common Omicron variant. So they've been working on it. As you know now, Omicron BA.1 has been replaced by Omicron BA.4, BA.5. So both companies are also working on a bivalent vaccines, which will combine the original strain and Omicron BA.4, BA.5. At this stage, no final decision has been made on which bivalent vaccines will be available and when it will be available, because both need to get an authorization from the EMA. And of course, the process is still actually has only been launched very recently. So we don't know when this authorization will come. But I want to convey to you a few important messages. First of all, in terms of quantity, we will have enough vaccines available, as I say, to protect the European population and very likely also to donate outside of the EU. First element. Second element, whatever bivalent vaccine is finally bought or available in Europe, it will be a good vaccine. It will be a better vaccine even against BA.4, BA.5. It's clear, based on the tests that we have seen, that whatever bivalent vaccine will be there will be a very good one. And third element, which I believe is also extremely important for you, that we need also to make sure that we get an approval by EMA, because it's key that we want to have to protect our population. Safety is important. But the key message is also, and coming to what Andrea has said, as soon as we start the vaccination campaign after the summer, the better it will be. So we need also to have those vaccines available as soon as possible in September, because most member states want to start the vaccination campaign in September. I would stop here just in time and to allow you for more questions, because I'm sure you will have many more questions.
I'm quite sure of that as well. Thank you very much, and also for keeping within the time. I'm looking at the EPP. Mr. Girompoulos isn't here yet. I wait for him, and otherwise I give the floor to... If you would want to take the floor, absolutely, Mrs. Kloone, take the floor. 2 minutes.
Minutes, yeah. Well, I won't
not
more.
2 minutes.
I know there is an awful lot there.
Can I just say to everybody, please indicate to whom your question. If it's for both, okay. It's for both. But otherwise, yeah. It's much more efficient if you say to whom you raise your question. Thank you very much,
okay.
Mrs. Kloone.
Well, I'd like to thank both speakers for a lot of very valuable information, and thank them for that. I think it has been. And maybe just one thing that I'd just like to focus on, and it's probably what Dr. Amon had said to us about in the ECDC, well, about the over 60s now, and their statement last week that over 60s should get the vaccine right now rather than September. That's what I'm understanding, which I can understand that they're not at risk. And if she would just if it maybe, and it's for Mr. Delso also, if you could clarify, you said that there would be a different type of vaccine, an adapted vaccine available in September. Well, after the summer. So is that, I mean, where does that leave the over 60s that should get a vaccine now? And then maybe will there be a temptation to wait for the adapted vaccine in September? Can we just clarify that? Because my understanding is, now is the time to have the vaccine and let September take its course, particularly for those over 60s. And could I also ask, on the the numbers that are escalating in our hospitals, do we have any detail or data on how many people have had vaccine of those that are hospitalised? If you have any information on that, and that would be probably for Dr. Amon as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kroon. Mrs. Lopez, please.
Sí, muy buenos días. Quiero en primer lugar agradecer tanto al señor Del Saus, miembro de la ERA, como a Andrea Amon por sus dos intervenciones y sobre todo también por el papel que han jugado estas dos agencias durante los dos últimos años de la pandemia del COVID principalmente, ¿no? Mi pregunta va dirigida al señor Del Saus y en concreto dos de las funciones principales que tiene la ERA son la evaluación de posibles amenazas, uno de los elementos de la política de prevención, y este comité COVID tiene una tarea muy importante durante el próximo año, que es evaluar qué cosas podemos mejorar que hemos visto que podemos mejorar durante la pandemia del COVID y cómo podemos reforzar a la Unión Europea para que en futuras crisis salgamos más reforzados y trabajemos de una manera más coordinada y más eficiente. Por lo tanto, mi pregunta sería ¿qué mecanismos de evaluación de posibles amenazas podemos mejorar para el futuro? ¿Qué mecanismos podemos utilizar en organismos como la EMA? Y también una política que me parece muy importante, que es la disponibilidad de material sanitario, no solamente de vacunas. El señor hacía referencia a esa política de tener unas vacunas suficientes a partir de septiembre. Me parece fundamental, pero también tenemos que recordar que en los hospitales, en las residencias, en los centros de mayores ha habido durante los primeros periodos de la pandemia una escasez de materiales como por ejemplo los EPIs. Me gustaría saber también qué política están ustedes trabajando y sobre todo qué podríamos mejorar en este comité COVID para futuras crisis. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Delso, please, for quick answers. And then I go to Mrs. Amon to add.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe, Mr. Klumer, your questions are more related to Mrs. Amon, but I will come back at least briefly on what you say. Mrs. Lopez, on your questions on, health threat analysis, actually yesterday we have just published actually the first 3 main health threat analysis from ERA. So we have made a press release. We have explained to it what we consider. I'm not going to enter into the detail, but so we have done this analysis. We have talked to experts, national expert, international expert, ERA expert, of course, and all of us, we have defined what are the 3 main health threats on which we need to work on. Because, of course, identifying health threat is one dimension, but what is even more important, and coming back to your second point, is, of course, to take medical countermeasures to try to address those health threats. And to come back to what you say on the mask and so on, equipment, it's part also of the mandate of ERA to build medical countermeasures. So we are looking at stockpiling, using the budget which is there to try to look at what kind of stockpiling we'll have to take. So I will send you, if you want to, we can send you the press release, or my colleague will send you. I will send around so you will share, you can get access to it. On your question, Mrs. Kloon, it's very difficult. I'm in this situation. Should I get vaccinated? I'm being an old man. I'm in this situation. Should I get vaccinated now, or should I wait for the new adapted vaccines which will come after the summer? If you ask the question to Andrea has already been very clear. It's better to be vaccinated now because, the current vaccine, as I say, are still effective. But if you are not vaccinated, you will get an adapted vaccine after the summer. And in any case, if you are vaccinated now with the current vaccine, you can still be vaccinated with the adapted vaccines later on. Of course, it will be, sometime December or whatever, but it will be later on. So it will be a personal choice. But Andrea will come back on that, I'm sure.
Then I give the floor to Mrs. Amon, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. we have considered the fact that, of course, people may be confused. Should I get the vaccine now or later? But what triggered us for this statement was the fact that the wave is starting now. And most over 60-year-olds have had their booster more than 3 to 6 months ago. And that means that the effectiveness against severe disease may have decreased to a level that they are now at higher risk or benefit from a booster now. So the fact that there is a wave starting now was the trigger for us to say, well, the over 60s now. We also have to consider if the adapted vaccines are authorized in September. That's still 2 months from now. By that time, the current wave may already over the peak or already over in some countries. So the risk for people is now, and that is the background for this advice. So the personal question: if I get offered this vaccine now, I will take it now. Just to be very clear. And regarding your question among the hospitalized, whether they're vaccinated or not, we haven't done an analysis on the increasing trend right now yet, but we have done at earlier waves, and there it was always, of course, you can also get to hospital when you're vaccinated, but the likelihood that you're hospitalized is much higher when you're not vaccinated. But we will update this calculation with the data that are coming in now.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Tille-Lenoir, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, merci à tous les deux pour
both
vos
of you
présentations claires et
your
précises.
clear
Alors,
and precise
nous sommes ici pour tirer les
We
leçons.
are here to
Madame la
learn.
directrice, vous le savez, la Commission Envie a plébiscité hier le rapport sur le menace transfrontière grave pour la santé, ce qui laisse imaginer la publication du nouveau règlement de l'ECDC à l'automne. Ce nouveau règlement pérennise vos responsabilités, les outils et les mécanismes qui ont été un peu improvisés pendant la crise et renforce vos ressources. Alors, comment allez-vous pouvoir travailler dans de meilleures conditions en termes de collecte des données, en termes d'élargissement de la surveillance de l'impact sur les autres maladies chroniques et en termes de création d'un portail de communication vis-à-vis du grand public. Monsieur le directeur, félicitations d'abord pour votre nomination. Nous avons déjà beaucoup parlé de la gouvernance d'ERA. Je voudrais venir sur ces aspects opérationnels. Comment envisagez-vous l'indépendance de cette autorité et l'absence de conflit d'intérêts de vos experts? Comment prévoyez-vous les liens avec le Parlement européen, puisqu'ils ont été actés? Comment coordonnez-vous vos actions avec les autres agences sanitaires, puisque lorsque nous les interrogeons, nous avons souvent du mal à obtenir cette réponse? Comment évoquez-vous les cartographies de production des contre-mesures médicales? Le Conseil, dans nos négociations, avait l'air un peu réticent. Dernière question budgétaire. Pour la variole du singe, vous avez sécurisé des financements de EU for Health pour payer ces vaccins. Est-ce que vous allez pérenniser cette utilisation des budgets santé pour les vaccins à venir? Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Mrs. Metz, please.
Sorry, I have a little problem here. Good morning, and thank you very much also to the expert, Dr. Amon and Mr. Delso, for being with us this morning. just to understand, my first question is on the situation you were relating, what we are facing right now. Just to understand, so we are dealing now, or we have contracts now for the adapted vaccine with 4 companies, right? And you say, and I'm happy to hear that you have some more flexibilities now regarding delivery. So it's these 4, BioNTech, Moderna, Sanofi and Hipra, who work as, just to understand, on the adapted vaccines now, and that's the only one. And I'm also keen to know if you change other things in the contracts, not only on the flexibility of delivery, but also regarding donations and indemnification, that it is also, I hope, more transparent to the large public in general. So that's my question on the current situation. And then, as we are here for the lessons learned, I would like to ask Dr. Amon if she believes that they really have enough staff right now to conduct the missions during the pandemic. So looking back, and what does she wish regarding staff for the future? And also to the ECDC, how difficult it was to collect data from the member states, and what could be done better there, what could be made more smoothly there. And then coming back to Monsieur Delso, to HERA, I was wondering how HERA could maybe support the European hospitals in coordinating better their efforts in the future. Would it be possible, for example, to organize common training sessions in order to be better prepared? And then my last question also to Monsieur Delso and to HERA. Do you believe stockpiling is enough, or would the EU not be better prepared for situations of health crisis by investing in public pharmaceutical manufacturing sites for essential medicines? So that is more general regarding health crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Metz. Mrs. Limmer, please.
Herzlichen Dank. Meine Fragen gehen insbesondere an Frau Amon. Ihre Behörde, die ECDC, zusammen mit der EMA, haben ja jetzt gerade zur zweiten Boosterimpfung aufgerufen. Meine Frage, warum ist Ihrer Meinung nach eine Impfung immer noch die einzige Lösung bei der Bekämpfung von Covid-19? Und beantworten Sie diese Frage insbesondere im Hinblick auf erstens, eine offizielle deutsche Bundesbehörde, das Robert-Koch-Institut, hat in seinem neuesten Bericht davon gesprochen, dass bei den wegen Corona Hospitalisierten mindestens 82% doppelt Geimpfte sind und 2/3 davon geboostert. Weiter wird wortwörtlich ausgeführt, dass es bei der Berechnung der Impfeffektivität zu negativen Werten kommen kann und die Boosterimpfung ist bis zu 3 Monate, also natürlich auch gern kürzer, wirksam, um schwere Verläufe und Tod zu verhindern. Die Impfung verhindert also nicht eine Erkrankung oder eine Hospitalisierung. Zweitens, die EMA hat ja selbst vor ständiger Wiederholung der Impfung gewarnt. Gilt das nun nicht mehr oder gilt das auch nicht mehr für die neuen Impfvarianten? Drittens, die Deutsche Kassenärztliche Vereinigung hat Zahlen veröffentlicht, wonach allein 2021 mindestens 2,5 Millionen Personen in Deutschland mit Impfnebenwirkungen erfasst wurden, die mindestens so schwer waren, dass sie einer Behandlung bedurften. Und eine andere deutsche Krankenkasse meldete, dass von Januar bis August 2021 mehr und längere Krankschreibungen wegen Impfnebenwirkungen als wegen Erkrankungen mit Corona vorlagen. Viertens, es gibt ja hochwirksame antivirale Mittel wie Paxlovid, die im Gegensatz zu den Impfungen sehr effektiv die Virusvermehrung im Erkrankungsfall stoppen und so auch die Infektionskette unterbrechen. Meine Frage an Sie, warum werden diese Medikamente von Ihnen nicht ansatzweise so beworben wie eine offensichtlich unwirksame und nebenwirkungsträchtige Impfung? Vielen Dank, ich bin gespannt auf Ihre Antwort.
Dankeschön. I first give the floor for answers to Mrs. Amon, please. Mrs. Amon.
Yeah, thank you very much. First to Ms. Lenoir and also to Mrs. Metz, because regarding the data collection. Now, data collection and the surveillance is one of the lessons where we have seen that we have to improve the system. And it is mainly due to the fact that the current systems are too much requiring human input. So here the hope is to look for digital solutions where we have, and that's more for the question how we will now change the data collection, where we have already some pilot projects ongoing where we see how we can collect the information that we need for the surveillance from electronic health records, so that there is no intermediary need to put in the information into a system because it's already input into the system. So that is one of the things that we are looking at for severe acute respiratory infections. Some countries that are already prepared to do this are working with us on this, and we hope that we learn from there how we can speed up the introduction of such a model also in other countries. Regarding a communication portal for the wider public, we have not the intention to have a specific communication portal for the public. However, we have now agreed with our with the member states that we can have the general public as a audience, as a target audience for our communication, which means that we will continue and increase what we have started already during the pandemic. That is that many of our more scientific outputs are converted in infographics or easy to understand videos, so that the message gets across also to non-scientific populations. That's not only the in particular, of course, the general population, but also other audiences that may not have a scientific background. Now, regarding the staff, of course, if you ask me if we have enough, the answer is always we could do with more. But I also am aware of the realities that we have, and that means that it's a overall resource distribution question. I only can say that what we intend to do is clearly outline what we can do with the current resources and what you can expect from us with the current resources. We have currently deployed 2 staff to neighboring countries of the Ukraine for supporting the work and the support with the refugees. Now, regarding the vaccines, vaccines are, of course, not the only measure that you can take against any disease. But it is a preventive measure. It doesn't prevent everything. The vaccines are designed to avert hospitalization, severe disease, and they do this, but not to 100%. And this is why, of course, you find also among the hospitalized people that are vaccinated. So that is not per se a signal that the vaccines are useless. It's just that they're not working in 100%. And if you want to do really an assessment of the vaccine effectiveness, you have to not only look at the vaccinated and hospitalized hospitalized, you have to compare it with the non-vaccinated. And that is why we are in the process with the EMA to put up a system for monitoring the vaccine effectiveness on a continuous basis. Regarding the side effects, the vaccine safety is a matter for our colleagues in the EMA, and I would ask you kindly to direct such questions to the EMA colleagues, because we do not have the overview. So I can't reply on this to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Delso, please.
Sorry, thank you very much. Maybe, again, I would like to repeat what I said in my introduction. You might have read in The Economist, there is the report about a study, very serious study, which has shown that 20 million of people have been saved worldwide because of the vaccines. And I believe this is something which is quite important, and we should take that into account. So the vaccines have saved lives and continue to save lives. Now, moving to Madame Trillet-Lenoir, governance. I know it has been a very sensitive topic. My message to the Parliament is very clear. ERA is fully transparent with Parliament. We send you all the documents which are sent to the Member State. You get a copy of everything. So we don't want to hide anything from the Parliament. You are more than welcome to participate in any kind of meeting you want to do, but we know what is the situation. But my message to you, I'm also willing to come to you, to the Parliament, as often you want me to come and to be fully transparent with you, because you need to be part of the governance of ERA. I said it from the beginning, I continue to repeat it. And it's not, it's not just like words to please you because I'm in the Parliament, it's a reality. So I really want this, and I want you to continue to work with me, and I'm willing to come every week if you want to. I don't believe you want to, but I'm willing to do it, if needed. So that's one element on the governance issue. On the relationship with, and of course we take into account conflicts of interest and we need to avoid it. On the governance with other agencies like ECDC and EMA, we are working on some kind of memorandum of understanding which would clarify exactly the respective roles of EMA, ECDC and ERA, compared to ERA, of course. We have not yet finalized those memorandum of understanding because this was linked also to the definitive role given to EMA and ECDC after the legislation which has been negotiated. So that's why we didn't want to finalize it. Now that we know that we have an agreement, we will finalize those memorandum of understanding if Andrea is willing to do it. I hope she is willing to do it. On the question of the industrial capabilities of the member state, yes, it's a difficult issue, but we believe this is something which is important, because if we really want to be effective, we need to know exactly what's out there, what is available and what could be done. And that's very something which is extremely complicated, but we want to do it and we will continue to work on it. By the way, for your information, we have launched a call for EU Fab, this idea of ERA to reserve production's capability in case of a crisis. We have not yet, of course, made the final evaluation, but probably it should be, the name of the companies which will be selected should be known probably, after the summer. I don't know when exactly, After the summer is a notion which is very vague in Brussels terms. But anyway, it will be after the summer. On the monkeypox, on the question of monkeypox, yes, what we have done on monkeypox, just to maybe, I did not mention in my introduction because that's not the purpose of this committee, but I believe that's a good example of what ERA can do for the member states. What have we done? We have used a budget, EU4Health budget, which was foreseen for the purchase of vaccines. And as ERA, we have collectively negotiated on behalf of all member states, we have negotiated with the company. And we have purchased, as ERA, with this budget, we have purchased those vaccines, and then we have donated them to the different member states. Why was it important? Because you have to realize, with the surge of the monkeypox cases, this company, which is a relatively small company, was flooded with requests from everywhere in the world. And so smaller member states simply did not even get access to this company, because this company was not interested in selling relatively low quantities of vaccines for those member states. Even some bigger member states were in a difficult situation because even those bigger member states didn't want to purchase a lot of vaccines. By working collectively as ERA, And by doing the purchase, etc., we've been able to achieve and to get access to those vaccines and to distribute them to the different member states. So to come back to your question, yes, it's a way to work which we probably can continue to do in the future. Of course, I don't hope that we will have health crisis every 6 months, so that's not the purpose. But if needed, yes, we want to do it. Now, moving to the different questions from Mrs. Metz, maybe just to clarify, because maybe I was not clear in my explanation. So we have what we call purchase agreement, which, with so far with Pfizer-BioNTech, one purchase agreement, another one with Moderna, and a third one with Sanofi. The first two agreements, we have already vaccines which have been delivered. Sanofi, we are still waiting for the authorization. But they are working on a booster, which should be available sometime in the future, but I don't know when, because it's subject to the authorization from EMA, which will take some time probably. That's the first element. With HIPRA, it's a slightly different issue, because we no longer have the legal basis to purchase the HIPRA vaccine. So what we are doing, we are negotiating what we call a joint procurement. Joint procurement is collectively on behalf of the member states. And we see where we end up, of course, when HIPRA will get its authorization. I hope I'm clear on that. Now, what you have to know is that under the contract that we have signed with Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech, we have the possibility to replace the current vaccines by adapted vaccines when they will be available. So that's why I was telling you we have stopped the delivery of the current vaccines because member states have enough, and we wait for the adapted vaccines to be there, and then we will switch from the current vaccines to an adapted vaccines. Which one will be available at that moment? Just to be very clear on that aspect. And again, I want to repeat myself, whatever bivalent vaccines will be available will be a good one. It will be better than the current vaccines. Let's be very clear. Whatever it will be there. So I hope I'm clear now on the rest of the contract. It's not changed. So in other words, we have not changed the question about donation, the questions about all those questions are still there. So in other words, those adapted vaccines which will come after the summer, if member states want to donate them, it will be possible under the same condition. So nothing has been changed from that point of view. And as you know, as Europe, we have given quite a lot. I would maybe speak up. So training, yes, very good idea. We are working on it. We want to do it. So we will do training also for hospitals. That's, of course, in case of crisis, not for everything. That's something which is important. On your last question, yes, it's a very important question. We are not yet there. The only point is EUFAB, which I mentioned before. And I stop here because I've been too long. Sorry for that.
Yeah, but it's important. These answers are really very important. So I let a little bit more time to answer. Monsieur Terres, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you so much. The first question that I have is for both guests, and it's related to side effects. Because we heard here how effective these vaccines are, and it was quoted a report that these vaccines allegedly save 20 million people around the world. But when one of our colleagues asked about the side effects, Mrs. Ellman said that you guys do not have the full view of the side effects. And I think the way this story is presented right now is misleading us. Because if we talk about the efficacy and how well these vaccines are, we also have to take into consideration the side effects. So the first question is, people who clearly have side effects, because we have a lot of people in the EU right now with side effects about or after they receive these vaccines. What exactly do they have to do? Who should they contact? Because we receive a lot of emails and we don't know what to do with them. So who should we direct them to? To HERA, to EMA, to ECDC, to get an answer about, somehow being compensated. Now, the efficacy of these vaccines. More than or almost 2 years ago, we were told that these vaccines are working in 95% of the cases. We've seen over time that this percentage decreased. It was initially 95, then 85, then 65, and now we don't know exactly for sure how much the efficacy of these vaccines are. So the question is, are you guys aware how exactly this 95% of efficacy was initially calculated? Because the tests on humans started in the month of March and April 2020, when in many of the countries around the world and around the EU, people were forced to stay in homes for 2 or 3 months. So when the efficacy of these vaccines were actually tested, the subjects, were they obligated to follow the same restrictive norms as everybody else, or people who were subjected to these tests, were they purposely exposed to the virus so we would know for sure that these vaccines are working or not. The last question is in regards to the contracts. We heard here that the contracts are saying this and that, and they were amended. My question is, have you seen those contracts? Because we haven't. And it is kind of odd to talk here about some contracts and some documents that none of us here in this room saw them. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Konechna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will have a 2 or 3 questions to General Director of HERA. The COVID-19 pandemic has served to demonstrate that health is a global concern, and in the case of responding to emergency scenarios such as a pandemic, strong international cooperation between countries is an urgent and absolute need. This is reflected in data and intelligence sharing, how to look at the fact that countries dispose of vaccine instead of donation them before the end of life to other countries where there is a shortage of vaccine, in vaccine development and in supporting countries with weaker health system or resilience. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU has struggled to show the right leadership and way how to deal with the pandemic by blocking the waiver of intellectual property rights for vaccine and treatment against COVID-19. Unfortunately, this is a disgrace that will haunt us for years to come. To what extent will HERA engage and be proactive in the creation of improved global mechanism for health emergency planning and preparedness? Will HERA provide its view in respect of the new WHO pandemic treaty? And the very currently question, how to look at the fact that countries dispose of vaccine instead of donating them before the end of life to other countries where there is a shortage of vaccine. We heard very often last weeks that the countries, not only European countries, that for example, so Canada and others, dispose of vaccine and not give it to somebody who needs it. It's a crazy situation because I think that this is something what we don't want. And the last very current question is about the Ukraine, because Russian military aggression in Ukraine has a short-term and long-term negative impact on the most areas of life, including the provisions of health services to the population. Various objective sources testified that the Ukraine health system lacked the most elementary means of treatment. Particular concern in the lack of vaccine, including vaccine for children. The current situation poses the risk of an outbreak of pandemics. The risk is not limited to the territory of Ukraine.
Mrs. Konechna, really, you have to wrap up.
Okay, so the last question is, in the Commission planning to make a systematic effort clarifying the situation regarding the lack of vaccination in Ukraine and planning concentrate support action? This is a very current question, I think.
Okay. That concludes the rounds of the political groups, and I give the floor to Mr. Del Sol.
I've learned my lesson. I will be very short, but right to the point. Side effects, yes. Of course, you always have side effects, but billions of people have been vaccinated in the world, and I believe that the side effects of the COVID, of those who have been sick with the COVID, is probably much higher than those who have been vaccinated. So, but that's an issue, of course, clearly. On the question of efficacy, yes, of course, we did not ask people to get infected. I mean, companies did not ask people to get infected just to test the efficacy, but that's the way, things are being tested, so we cannot change the way it's being done. And on the contracts, I know it's a recurrent debate in this committee, which I understand. I'm not, I don't believe I need to repeat what has already been said by previous commissioners and so on. We will, I know I've seen that you want to have a specific meeting on this after the summer, so let's discuss in this context. On your, Mrs. College, on your points, and again, I'll try to be very short. Cooperation, yes, of course we want cooperation. But let me tell you one thing. Now, today, Member States are willing to give millions and millions of COVID vaccines to poor countries. You know what is the problem? They don't want them. They don't want them. So we are doing every day. I have colleagues spending hours, weekends, days and nights trying to get a way for those vaccines to go to poor countries. They simply don't want them now. I'm sorry for that. They don't want it. That's a fact. I'm not, and you have to realize that we have collectively given close to 500 million vaccines to poorer countries. We are the largest donors in the world. Not only that, we have accepted, while others were closing their borders, we have accepted that half of the European production of vaccine is being exported outside of the EU. In the same time, other parts of the world were closing their borders. And you mentioned Canada, for instance. Canada at the beginning, they got the vaccine not from the US, from Europe. So Europe has been solidaire. But again, I fully agree with you. We want to donate. I can tell you we give everything to try to donate those vaccines. Simply not possible for the moment. Maybe it will be different after the summer. I don't know. But we should not be blamed for what we are not doing. We are doing it. But we simply cannot obtain demand. Last point on Ukraine, just to say we are working on it. And we are fully aware of what you say about Ukraine, the need for vaccines, the need to do things. So as ERA, I'm not going to go into the details, but I can tell you we are working on that issue of Ukraine, not only for Ukraine also, but also for the neighboring countries which are receiving Ukrainian refugees, which can be a problem. I stop here because otherwise.
Mrs. Amon, please.
Yeah, just to complement what Pierre has been saying on the question someone who has side effects should contact. The compensation, if there are severe side effects related to the vaccine, which has to be established first, is at national level. So the countries have in their countries a process where the patients can turn to, and the first contact point would be of course their treating physicians, who then can do this, carry this further. Otherwise, I have nothing to add to what Pierre has said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now go to the Catch the Eye, and I look first to Mr. Kinopoulos.
Very much, and thank you both. Director General Mr. Delso and Director Ms. Amon for your presence and especially for your concrete input and for your clarity of your answers. I just wanted to reiterate that ACPP have been at the forefront of asking for more EU actions in the area of healthcare. And therefore, we are glad to see ECDC mandate being expanded and the creation of HERA. And that goes to Mr. Amon. I wanted you to briefly elaborate how this extended mandate help us improve our pandemic preparedness and response. I believe it is important for our fellow citizens to understand that the added value the EU brings in their lives. In terms of the epidemiological situation, we're concerned about the increase in cases, rates, in particular of the variants of concern. This comes at a time when immunity is waning and where forecast of cases is increasingly more unreliable due to changes in testing criteria and reporting procedures. Having reliable data and forecasting, as we can consider, is very crucial. I wanted therefore to ask Mr. Amon, how close are we in agreeing on common criteria for case identification and testing strategies? Do we also do enough in terms of using complementary surveillance systems such as wastewater monitoring? And finally, to Mr. Delso, what is the state of play in terms of strengthening the existing SARS-CoV-2 network of laboratories? I believe they have a crucial role to play in the characterization of emerging variants and their impact on the effectiveness of vaccines and therapeutics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now go to the rest of the list that I have in front of me. I just read out so that everybody can see who's on the list, and if somebody wants to be added, just please let me know. Mr. Lucke, Mrs. Weiss, Mrs. Rosa D'Amato, Mrs. Joron, Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Fritzon, Mrs. de la Pisa. Right, sorry. That's it? Okay, we stick strictly to 1 minute, because otherwise our guests cannot answer the question. So I give the floor to all of you, but just for 1 minute. Mr. Lucke, please. Mr. Lucke.
Thank you, Chair. And I would try to be very brief, but I would like to use the chance that we have ECDC here, and I would like to address a very crucial issue that needs more attention, which is long and post-COVID, that was underestimated for a long time. And now we're talking about up to 10% of people suffering from mid- and long-term effects. And of course, without the vaccine, we would have seen people more suffering. This is for sure. But the vaccine alone does not prevent from post-acute sequelae sufficiently. So my 3 questions would be, especially to ECDC, but if Mr. Delceau, you have the urgent need to say something in addition, of course I'm very glad. Are you planning to collect EU-wide data about long COVID risks, also in regard to different variants? And also I know this is very difficult with different vaccination status. And how about a European network of long COVID experts? And in the end, you talked about some guidelines back in April. Are you working on these currently as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Weiss, please.
Thank you so much. My question goes to Mr. Delceau. Thank you for being here. I'm here. Waste-water-based surveillance has been acknowledged as a very cost-efficient way to trace potential hotspots, and also to direct other measures. Do we have to wait until the Urban Wastewater Directive is being recasted before we see that all member states are taking that on board? And what can you update us in the HERA competences towards strengthening this very, very, again, cost-efficient, but also very efficient tool to do surveillance? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. D'Amato.
I will speak in Italian, so thank you. Io vorrei ritornare un attimo sulla questione della dose booster velocemente, perché è consigliata per la popolazione over 60 ma anche per i soggetti fragili, io suppongo, quindi sotto i 60 anni. I dubbi nascono non soltanto perché siamo davanti ad una variante diversa rispetto alla Delta, siamo di fronte alla variante 5, i vaccini che abbiamo oggi sono, li avete definiti voi stessi, vecchi. Poi proporrete probabilmente fra 3 mesi, quando gli effetti di questo vaccino saranno finiti, perché così l'efficacia è veramente limitata nel tempo, con un'altra dose di vaccino. Ma appena a gennaio ci è stato detto che adottare una strategia basata esclusivamente sul somministrare continuamente dosi booster alla popolazione non era quella giusta da seguire, visto che potrebbe portare ad un serio indebolimento del sistema immunitario della popolazione. Cosa è cambiato nelle vostre opinioni in questi momenti? Non sarebbe il caso di migliorare i piani pandemici, i sistemi sanitari nazionali, le cure? Qual è il protocollo? Vigile attesa, i tachipirina ancora? Cosa consigliate da questo punto di vista?
Oui, merci. J'aimerais m'adresser à Monsieur Delceau. Curieusement, vous n'avez pas mentionné Valneva. Alors, on va reprendre un peu l'historique. Le 10 novembre, la Commission déclare un achat anticipé de 60 millions de doses auprès de Valneva. Le 10 juin, la Commission souhaite résilier l'accord de fourniture du vaccin Valneva. Le 22 juin, Pfizer entre dans le capital de Valneva à hauteur de 8%. Le 23 juin, l'EMA et la Commission accordent l'autorisation de mise sur le marché à Valneva pour son vaccin anti-Covid. L'action a doublé en 2 semaines. Cela pose aussi la question du délit d'initié. Contrairement aux autres candidats vaccins, il ne s'agit pas d'une autorisation de mise sur le marché conditionnel, mais d'une mise sur le marché définitive pour 5 ans. Vous venez de conclure un contrat pour l'achat de 100 000 doses contre la variole du singe. J'ai donc 2 questions autour de ces actions. Alors que le traité ne vous confère aucune responsabilité de cette nature, veuillez nous préciser en vertu de quel mandat des États membres la Commission a-t-elle cru pouvoir procéder à ces achats. La France est en train de jeter 3,6 millions de doses AstraZeneca, soit 10 millions d'euros. Nous sommes moins de 450 millions de citoyens européens. Pourquoi la Commission a bloqué 4,3 milliards de doses? Est-ce que parce qu'elle savait qu'à l'époque, le vaccin avait besoin d'une dose de rappel tous les 4 mois car inefficace? Et pour terminer, est-ce que ce vaccin Valneva n'aura pas besoin de rappel avec des vaccins de type ARN messager, comme ce fut le cas pour le vaccin Janssen, pour continuer à avoir un pass sanitaire? Je vous remercie.
Please, colleagues, a minute. Mrs. Anderson.
Yes, good morning. And once again, all we are hearing here is about vaccines. My God, you are injecting perfectly healthy people with an experimental drug, literally shoving it down their throats and potentially harming millions and millions of people. Look at the data on vaccine injuries. So I really only have one question for you. How can you even live with yourselves? Thank you.
Mrs. Fritzon, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Directors, for your presentations. You have made important contributions to the EU institutions as well as the Member States, but multiple studies have shown the importance of incorporating gender analysis into the preparedness and response and to promote gender and health goals. So, and we can see an examination of 115 COVID-19 decision-making and expert task forces across 87 countries found that 85% the majority of members are men, according to EIGE. And fortunately, the truth is that the gender perspective has to a large extent been lacking in the EU response. So I would like to ask how ECDC has incorporated a gender perspective in your work throughout the crisis, and in what way you will improve this work for future crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. de la Pisa.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, pues yo tengo que mostrar mi desilusión. La verdad que tener la oportunidad de hablar con expertos para que al final el tema se monopolice solo en vacunas, ¿por qué no se amplía, ¿no? La temática de estas ponencias? ¿Por qué no recibimos información sobre la evolución epidemiológica, la comparación entre países, tratamientos orales retrovirales al principio de la enfermedad cuando la carga viral es baja, otros tratamientos, sobre la inmunidad natural? Hablamos de vacunas, una inmunidad artificial y no la natural. Un análisis serio de los aumentos de mortalidad, los descensos de fertilidad. Preocupa que se presuma de eficacia cuando se está hablando de vacunar a las personas cada 3 meses, cuando se sabe que se debilita el sistema inmunitario. Cuando uno se pone la vacuna, lo habrán experimentado ustedes, lo pasa mal, muy mal, pero muy mal y además muchos días, con dolores en el brazo, fiebre, efectos secundarios que duran durante tiempo. ¿Es mejor o peor que el COVID? Pues no lo sé, pero está claro que nadie se ha puesto malo de COVID 6 veces. Y sí se ha tenido que vacunar 6 veces. Y si es así, vamos a ver, vamos a dar la información. Ocúpense de promocionar la seguridad de la vacuna, no obligando y metiendo miedo. Después de 1 año y medio, la Comisión no ha renegociado que los laboratorios asuman las responsabilidades sobre los efectos secundarios. Es chocante.
And finally, Mr. Teres.
Side effects as well.
Mr. Teres.
Thank you. I want to comment to what Mr. De Lasso said about the side effects. We heard in the history people in power who, every time when the issue of abuse or of innocent people being harmed, the argument was, yes, but look how many people we saved on the other side. With all due respect, this is not a democratic position, I would say. And we should avoid looking at people this way. People who were harmed after being vaccinated by force or condition or somehow, tricked into being vaccinated, they have the same rights as as everybody else. So when we talk about vaccines, and a few weeks ago we voted to prolong 1 more year the green certificate, we have to look at these people as individuals with basic fundamental rights, and we have to talk about the side effects, not just look at the positive aspect, which we cannot deny, but we cannot also deny the fact that some people are suffering after the vaccines. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes this round of questions, and I would like to give the floor to first Mrs. Amon, and I know you have an impossible task to answer within 5 minutes all the questions, because both of you, I give you 5 minutes, already 5 minutes over my time, but please, Mrs. Amon, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really will try. So in terms of how does our new mandate help the people or help to ensure the people in the European Union that their preparedness and response will be improved. Now, the mandate foresees that we do joint assessments of the preparedness status. The countries have to report to the Commission, and based on these results, gaps in the preparedness will be identified, and then we support the countries in filling these gaps. For that, we will establish a EU health task force that supports the country when there are outbreaks and they require support, but also can support during the preparedness work. The whole work will entail indicators and so forth. I can't go into details right now, but it's quite a comprehensive approach, which I hope will be met by a willingness in the member states also to go down this road. The testing strategies, yes, we do. In the document that will come out next Monday, there are not only the sentinel systems, the hospitalized systems, there are other sources like excess mortality, the wastewater that was also mentioned here, also participative data. So we do consider other sources in the future as well. Now, the long and post-COVID is a phenomenon that is very difficult to grasp. Not for the people who have it, because they know they suffer, but it's scientifically very difficult to define it, and that makes it also very difficult to come to agreed numbers. I believe what is necessary here is really targeted studies in order to do what exactly you suggested, to see whether there were any differences according to the variant, whether you have been vaccinated and so forth, to get a better understanding what this condition is, what it's caused by, and potentially, of course, also how to prevent it. There is a EU network of experts. We have assembled this from the very beginning, and they are very valuable to us because it's a exchange. They tell us what the countries need, and are also very good in exchanging information between the countries, so that countries also can learn from themselves. Now, indeed, this is with the boosters. The idea is not to go to a mode with boosters every 3 months or every half year. You have to also keep in mind that this is a disease where the vaccination part is now 1.5 years old. That is in terms of really having a good foundation for future boosting, a very short period. So we're still learning here. And the idea is to do it influenza in the future, but we're not yet there. The virus is not stable. It's changing very quickly, and somehow we have to respond to that. It's not a matter of, boosting or improving the health systems. I think the improvement of the health systems is definitely something that we have to do in any case where it's needed. the gender perspective, I think that is something that where we really can improve. And thank you for bringing that up. We were very focused on certain groups in the population, but we didn't always pay enough attention to looking at the gender perspectives. I think I have exceeded my time already.
Yes, thank you very much, but that's quite okay. Thank you very much, Mrs. Hamon. Monsieur Delso.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. I will try to be very short also, like Andrea. First of all, on wastewater, yes, wastewater is very powerful to detect, possible diseases. Actually, we have used already, we have started, for instance, when Omicron came, actually, we have used it. So we are financing SERA, we are putting some money for member states to monitor the situation by using wastewater. Wastewater are important, for detecting when the disease is there, certainly COVID. That's the first element. It also could be very useful in different contexts for planes, If you analyze, actually, the wastewater from planes, it's also important to detect where diseases are coming. So that's something which, is important. So we are using it, we are putting money on it, and we want to put more money on it, despite the wastewater directive, which is a different issue. Second element, network of laboratory. Yes, we believe this is important. So we want to create a network of laboratories in Europe, which will help us actually to be more effective and more efficient to detect, diseases and how to treat them. So that's something we believe as ERA, which is important. Third remark. I don't believe in second-class citizens. We are all first-class citizens. That's the objective of ERA. So yes, of course, if some people complain about, the side effect, if they can demonstrate it, of course they should do it. I'm not saying it's. My point is simply, despite all this, despite all those consequences which are terrible for those citizens, vaccines have been very effective, and we should not deny it. But it's important that we do better. And maybe on vaccination, to follow up on a point which has been raised, it's true that because it's a relatively new disease, we are in a situation where vaccines actually are chasing the variant. So in other words, we are always behind the curve to a certain extent. I told you that, companies have been working on bivalent vaccines, which would include BA1, because at that time only BA1 was available. But the time you need to develop, even if it's extremely fast, the variant has changed. Unfortunately, that's the situation in which we are now and will continue to be for a certain time. But as ERA, we believe, and we are willing to invest money to try to work on the second generation of vaccines, which will be multivariant. So in other words, without the need to always follow up, chasing to adapt to a new variant, but trying to cover all kinds of possible coronavirus diseases. That's complicated. It will take some time, but we believe this is important, and that's certainly a way we all need to work together. On treatments, yes, treatments are important, of course. We are also, as ERA, we have been purchasing or negotiating with companies for different treatments. I'm not going to give you the list, but I can tell you we are working on it, and we believe this is something which is important. And of course, we should not, actually, if you want to fight the COVID, you need the vaccines, you need the treatment, and you need also some measures, which depending on the situation, epidemiological situation. On Valneva, I did not mention it because so far Valneva has not yet worked on a bivalent vaccine. That's the reason. So they are still they've just got their vaccines being approved just a few days ago. We had concluded what we call a purchase agreement with Valneva. We are now assessing the situation with the member state, where, what they want to do with these vaccines, because at the end of the day, it's for member state decisions. It's not only ERA decision, We are go-between, but at the end of the day, it's for the member state to decide what they want to do with the vaccines. And we are still in those discussions with Valneva, I can tell you that. And we will finalize probably very likely those discussions now. But I can tell you there is not inside trading, I've done many things in my life. In one point, I was responsible for negotiating a directive on inside trading, So I can tell you there was no inside trading, at least not from our side on that aspect. And maybe because, I want to be very efficient, one last point on gender, just to say, Mrs. Fritzon, I'm lucky enough to have a vast majority of female colleagues working in ERA. And I believe this is good because it gives a different perspective. Without lack of respect for my male colleagues who are over there, but it's still very good to have, also this female perspective, different gender perspective. I believe this is important.
Thank you very much for all the answers. Can I remind the colleagues if some of the issues questions are not answered, we can always come back on written procedure. That is always possible. We then bundle, not just one, but we bundle our questions towards HERA and ACDC, and you will come back at a later stage when we go in more depth in some of the issues. But thank you very much. I think it was interesting and good to follow up on the actual situation of the pandemic today. Thank you very much, and I'll now move on to the next item. Thank you very much. And that's item number 5. It's a short item, but a very important one. I would like to give the floor to our esteemed colleague, also the coordinator of the Renew, but the rapporteur of a very important piece of legislation that comes out of the pandemic, and that is the cross-border threats on health. And we sort of managed, well, you did, Veronique, managed to get an agreement, and it's, I think, good to have a very short, we take some time in this committee because it is of very big importance also for the report that we will be writing to make a reflection on the outcome of that piece of legislation. So Veronique, I give you the floor. We have around about 10 minutes to move on to the next, but please, I think it's important to just take that few minutes of time to get into the detail of the, not the detail, but the overall situation, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Je ne pense pas prendre 20 minutes de notre temps. Bien sûr, c'est mon rapport, mais c'est aussi et surtout un rapport collectif mené au Parlement par une équipe 100% féminine, ce qui me paraît important à préciser, avec des négociations qui ont été longues, qui ont été musclées, mais qui ont finalement abouti le 23 juin à un accord en trilogue, après 50 meetings techniques et 4 meetings politiques. Donc je voudrais aussi saluer toutes les équipes techniques qui ont contribué. Alors il s'agit de la révision sur les menaces transfrontières graves pour la santé, et comme j'ai eu l'occasion de le dire tout à l'heure,
And as I said earlier, please, if you have conversations, please, outside the committee meeting. Thank you very much.
Comme j'ai eu l'occasion de le dire tout à l'heure, il s'agit d'une partie, la partie politique du paquet Union européenne pour la santé, qui comporte également la révision des mandats de l'EMA et de l'ECDC. Donc les deux agences sanitaires ont été rehaussées en termes de ressources financières. C'est la raison pour laquelle j'ai demandé tout à l'heure à Madame Hamon dans quelle mesure ça l'aiderait à mieux travailler pour l'avenir. Donc le mandat de l'ECDC était dépendant de notre rapport et sera donc opérationnel à la rentrée si nous votons le rapport en plénière. Alors, très schématiquement, cette directive comporte 5 grands volets. Tout d'abord, il insiste sur une vision globale de la santé et en particulier sur des stratégies qui sont chères au Parlement européen, c'est-à-dire la vision Une seule santé, One Health, qui inclut dans un cercle vertueux la santé humaine, la santé animale et la santé environnementale. Et également la vision santé dans toutes les politiques, qui sera, je crois, l'approche que nous allons prendre dans cette commission lorsque nous aborderons les aspects non directement sanitaires de la crise. Enfin, et ça colle parfaitement avec le communiqué de presse de HERA dont M. Delso a parlé tout à l'heure, l'idée est de se préparer à d'autres crises, pas seulement des crises infectieuses, l'antibiorésistance bien sûr, mais pas que, et aussi des causes chimiques, biologiques, nucléaires, qui réclament également qu'on soit prêt. Prévention. Le terme de prévention est un mot que nous avons eu du mal à faire accepter au Conseil, ce qui est un peu étonnant après 2 ans de pandémie, mais c'est comme ça. La prévention sera assurée par des tests de résistance aux crises des tests nationaux, des tests européens qui pourront être évalués en termes de pertinence. J'ai mentionné aussi tout à l'heure la nécessité d'une cartographie des sites de production des contre-mesures médicales. Et M. Delso ne nous a pas caché qu'il était difficile d'obtenir cette information des États membres. Or, elle est essentielle parce que si on veut sécuriser et stocker des contre-mesures médicales, que ce soit des vaccins ou d'autres médicaments, il faut savoir où et comment ils sont produits. S'agissant de la coordination, beaucoup de sujets ont été abordés dans le précédent débat. Oui, il est prévu des formations conjointes des soignants, en particulier dans les régions transfrontalières, mais pas que, et des communications de données sur le nombre de lits disponibles, le nombre de soignants formés entre les États membres et avec les institutions. Il est également prévu d'améliorer la communication grand public. Et je crois que ce que nous avons entendu ce matin en termes de désinformation à propos des vaccins nous montre à quel point nous devons nous armer contre la désinformation qui est véhiculée dans les réseaux sociaux, dans le grand public et parfois même au sein du Parlement européen. Il faut mobiliser les agences concernées, faire en sorte qu'elles se coordonnent entre elles. Je trouve également très bonne, et nous l'avons retenu, l'idée d'un réseau de laboratoires de référence, de sorte qu'on n'ait plus ces disparités, cette hétérogénéité dans les tests diagnostiques. On a également évoqué ce matin la nécessité d'une approche mondiale, solidarité mondiale, mais aussi travail en lien avec l'OMS sur un traité international des pandémies. Néanmoins, nous avons demandé et obtenu que l'Union européenne puisse déclarer une pandémie avant même que l'OMS ne le fasse. C'est une forme d'émancipation de l'Union européenne. Un point qui nous était cher également était de demander que ce règlement permette qu'on mesure l'impact d'une crise sanitaire sur les maladies chroniques. Vous savez l'impact tragique qu'a eu la crise sanitaire sur les patients atteints de cancer. Non pas qu'ils soient morts du Covid, mais qu'ils aient subi des retards au diagnostic et au traitement à cause de l'encombrement des hôpitaux. Le point majeur des négociations a porté sur les achats conjoints de médicaments. Parce que c'est la réussite européenne de cette crise. Nous avons fait en sorte que ces achats conjoints comportent davantage de transparence, en particulier sur les contrats. C'était une demande très forte des parlementaires européens. Et aussi, et surtout, et ça a été difficile, une clause d'exclusivité faisant en sorte qu'une fois qu'un État membre s'est engagé sur un achat de médicaments, il ne puisse plus mener des négociations bilatérales et parallèles avec un laboratoire. Ça n'est pas open bar, c'est un engagement par lequel un État membre s'implique dans une dynamique collective d'achat conjoint. Nous l'avons obtenu et ça permettra que ces achats conjoints représentent un processus décisionnel commun. C'est à mon avis une étape importante de l'Union européenne pour la santé. Et puis le dernier point, c'est la gouvernance, parce que si la gouvernance n'est pas bien définie, rien ne fonctionne. Je ne vais pas revenir sur le conflit qui a eu lieu entre le Parlement et la Commission, sur un règlement du Conseil excluant le Parlement qui a mis en place ERA d'une manière précipitée la veille de Noël, sans concertation, et qui fait qu'actuellement, ERA est une direction générale de la Commission. Monsieur Delso nous a rassurés, sans même que j'ai besoin de le lui demander, sur le fait que le Parlement européen serait représenté dans les instances décisionnelles, en particulier de ERA, ainsi que les principales parties prenantes, au premier rang desquelles les associations de citoyens et de patients. Et nous avons également insisté, je l'ai refait tout à l'heure, sur la nécessité d'expertise dénuée de conflits d'intérêts. Voilà, donc il me semble que nous avons dans cette nouvelle directive les outils nécessaires à être mieux préparés. C'est une réponse à la demande de 74% des citoyens européens qui réclament que l'Union européenne soit davantage impliquée dans les processus décisionnels en santé. Une étape ultérieure pourrait être d'aller jusqu'à une révision des traités s'il s'avérait que ces compétences ne soient encore pas suffisantes. Dernier point, un peu d'optimisme, il me semble que dans la crise de la variole du singe, qui n'est pas comparable mais qui est quand même une crise infectieuse aiguë et inattendue, les mécanismes de réaction, aussi bien en termes de surveillance épidémiologique qu'en termes de sécurisation des contre-mesures médicales, ont été plus efficaces, plus rapides que lors de la pandémie précédente. Donc, nous avons déjà fait des progrès. Voilà, merci beaucoup et à votre disposition pour les questions que vous auriez éventuellement. Et désolé pour ma voix.
C'est pas Covid, hein?
It's not COVID, right, Véronique? You don't have COVID.
Merci beaucoup, Véronique, pour ta présentation. Does anybody have any questions? I don't think that's the case, and it's close follow-up in the Envy Committee, I'm sure. But I think it's very important because the Parliament isn't always 100% happy after a negotiation. That's normal, and there are issues that we will need to take back on board in our report when we look at the future. For instance, on what you said on HERA, but also on the contracting of future vaccines. But we'll come back to that. Let me move now swiftly to item number 6, which is an exchange of views with chief epidemiologists from EU member states. And today we have, in the morning, our first panel. In the afternoon, we have a second panel. And it is my honor to welcome, first of all, Professor Dr. Sotiros Tsiotras, who is the Chief Strategic Advisor to the Hellenic government on the COVID-19 pandemic in Greece, who is a very esteemed scientist, as I've been told, and by now, and I think that's the case in many member states, also very well known after the pandemic. And Mr. Tsiodras is remotely connected, and as you know, we have a strike, so I hope Mr. Tsiodras is able to do his presentation in English, but I'm been informed that that is the case. Secondly, I'm really very pleased to have next to me Dr. Erika Vliege, the chair of the COVID-19 Management Strategy Expert Group, known in Belgium as the GEMS, here in the room. And what is true for Dr. Tsiodras is true for Mrs. Vliege. Well, with or without her consent, she became one of the most well-known figures the last 2 years, explaining all of the time what was happening, how the measures were taken and why they were taken. And for that, I think both of them deserve our full appreciation and support. But that's not why we are here. We're here to discuss the lessons learned to our two epidemiologists. It's a very difficult English word, I have to say. I can tell them that we are a special committee with a mandate that has 4 pillars, and I'm not going to go in all these 4 pillars, but one of the pillars, of course, is also the lessons learned of the health crisis that this pandemic was. And both Mrs. Vliege as Mr. Tsiodras were like the first witnesses from the very first moment. And as I said in the beginning of this special committee, this is the right time to do the lessons learned, because within a few years, a lot of specialists would have moved on to other positions. And one of the things of humankind is we tend to forget rather fast, even with regard to big crises. And the second reason is, by the end of this committee term, we will be facing the next elections. And this is we're not going to write an election program, but what we are going to write with our report is more or less also the recommendation for the next Commission. How to take on board all these lessons for next crises, health crises, pandemics, and so on. So I think it's very important that we have the chief epidemiologist today with us, and I would like to give them the floor now, first for an introduction. They received a questionnaire that we prepared with the coordinators from the different political groups that will be the basis of their introduction, and after the introduction we go on the question and answers with the ping-pong method, but I'll come back to that when we start the question and answer. Mr. Tsiodras, are you online?
Yes, I am online.
Yes, voilà. I gladly would like to give you the floor, and welcome again, and thank you so much for taking the time for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairman, and I would like to thank the members of the European Parliament Special COVID Committee for the invitation. I would like to immediately address, in the sake of time, the questions forwarded to my attention. Next slide. The first question was, how did the COVID pandemic develop in your country? 4 million cases. Upper left corner, you see the case notification rate. With the blue, you see the death rate. The decoupling, the recent decoupling of case numbers with serious outcomes has been noted. And that is probably due to several factors, including immunity, both from vaccines and previous infection, as well as reinfection, age patterns, comorbidities, and potentially and not greater virulence of the Omicron subvariants. Preliminary data show this to exist for Omicron 1. On the right part of the slide, you see the testing that has significantly dropped. We still maintain significant numbers of testing compared to other European countries, and the positivity rate is in the lower right part of the slide. It's more than 15% at the moment. And on the lower left part of the slide, you see the reinfections over the total number of cases, which is close to 17%. This high rate of reinfections with the spread of the BA5 variant, which is currently close to 90% in our country in random sampling and genomic sequence, I think it's attributed to this. More than 20 million doses of vaccine have been used in our country. Next slide. The question continued, if you had to go back to January 2020, what would you advise your government and the EU to do differently? Next slide. In Greece, a nationwide lockdown to mitigate the transmission of the virus was imposed on March 23. We implemented a survey to assess social mixing patterns before the epidemic and during the lockdown. During the lockdown, daily contacts were reduced by 87%. The effective reproduction number, the famous R0, how many people you give the infection if you have it, it was close to 2.8 then, went down to 0.46. And the reduction of this famous R0 number attributed to lockdown was 81%. Whereas the reduction of different individual measures separately, you can see this on the right part of the slide, range between 10 and 24%. Measures like work and school, work and leisure, school and leisure closure, etc. What is the European lesson from this experience? For a novel virus with similar characteristics, only multiple measures implemented simultaneously could reduce the famous R0 below 1. On the other hand, measuring social mixing patterns can be a tool for real-time monitoring of epidemic potential of a novel virus. Next slide. There's a question of focusing on data collection, quality, comparability across countries, and effects on policies. Next slide. We used multiple epidemiological indices. We still use them, and we're following them for the epidemiological assessment. Nevertheless, quality surveillance requires and is affected by quality testing that was not widely available initially, our country included. We invested in a country-wide system of mobile units, offering testing free of charge to the general population, as well as distribution of self-tests after 1 year and a half. In the pandemic, the self-testing was distributed to the entire population in order to better follow up the pandemic. You see here more than 153,000 missions with mobile health units with 300 vehicles distributing more than 11 million rapid antigen tests and performing more than 1 million PCR tests that led to 500,000 new diagnoses, as well as exploiting this distribution and testing procedure for vaccinations, 130,000 vaccinations in more than 500,000 long-term care facilities, home care and psych facilities. And at the same time, the free self-test system in April 21, more than 100 million tests that led to more than 100,000 diagnoses. Next slide. A weekly epidemiological map was constructed with the follow-up of multiple indices like age distributions, and of course this can change with non-pharmaceutical interventions, vaccinations, infections, reinfections. We followed all serious outcomes, hospitalizations, intubations. Virological surveillance was performed, and we participated in the ECDC network for genomic surveillance, and of course each variant has its different effects, and we see that with the BA.5 variant now. Health system capacity was a very important index that we follow daily, like hospital admissions, discharge, new ICU admissions and intubations, and capacity of the COVID ICU system in the country. And we used artificial intelligence and sewage surveillance. As an example, in the following two slides, next slide, please. I show you the new hospitalization and deaths, and you can see here with the deep red colors, you see the people aged 85 and above. As we well know, the virus has affected the aged and the elderly much more than the younger populations below the age of 50. And of course, always when you assess deaths, you have to assess whether it's with or from the virus, and most countries in Europe followed the with pattern. Go to the next slide, please. In this slide, you see our latest data in the trends on hospitalizations. On the left part, data on simple bed occupancy in the hospitals and ICU bed occupancy. There is, again, the decoupling between trends in cases and trends in hospitalization versus trends in ICU bed occupancy in the country. Next slide. Based on all this data, more than 60 indicators, we were able to predict ICU bed capacity, short-term predictions always. You see here we go up to 2 months, but the predictions stand true for the interval 2 to 4 weeks after the initial prediction was made. And you see also the epidemiological map that was created last week in order to advise our policies and guide the policy actions at the local and national level. Next slide. We also invested in new tools like wastewater surveillance, building a national network, and the use of this network showed that it was a leading indicator of positive cases, hospitalizations, and ICU admissions by 5, 8, and 9 days, respectively. This has changed in 2022 with the Omicron variant, where we see a leading indicator in cases, but a decoupling with ICU admissions with BA.5. Next slide. We also used an artificial intelligence machine learning algorithm to screen travelers in Greece during the first summer, and this artificial intelligence tool led to the identification of more cases than random surveillance testing in the airports. That was a very, very good paradigm. It was published in Nature. Next slide. With regards to the question, how would you rate the quality of the data, especially its inter-European comparability? Next slide. I think we can say there's huge heterogeneity in testing that continues to exist and may be becoming more prevalent, as this recent ECDC map shows. For Germany, for example, they say insufficient data, and for the countries in grey is low testing rates, and the countries in white provide no data. Next slide. So this heterogeneity affected and continues to affect data quality. We have maintained, for the most part, high levels of testing that gives us a clearer picture, although the testing is dropping. The Greek CDC mobile unit system helped, and as the CDC states, comparisons between countries should be done with caution and relevant epidemiological expertise, even when using several indicators in combination. Next slide. Question number 3, was the NHS National Health System ready to cope with the pandemic? What are the main challenges in the months to come, especially the summer season with the increase in tourism and autumn and winter? Next slide. Significant issues were faced in our country in the initial phase of the pandemic, with surge capacity for the national health system, not only in Greece, of course, but everywhere in the world. We had to meet and respond to this crisis facing several obstacles, like the sudden increase in demand for services and the pressure in the system, especially critical care, but non-COVID as well. The enhancement of ICU infrastructure led to increase in ICU available beds, more than doubled our ICU beds. We had significant staff shortages. More than 15,000 people were hired to respond to this shortage. Of course, illness affected this phenomenon of staff shortages. Education is of paramount importance that may affect quality care, and we identified regional differences and, of course, common therapeutic protocols in time of actually ongoing research for best therapy, especially at the initial phase of the pandemic, was a big challenge. Next slide. Now, what the situation will be in the following months, it depends on several factors. At the moment, increase in hospitalizations with no big increase in deaths, likely a result of super spreading BA.5 variant, and hybrid immunity in the population. Most of the population is already infected at least once. Hybrid immunity appears to perform better as far as immunological parameters like neutralizing antibodies. And you see here the coupling, this is WHO figure, between cases and global deaths as of the beginning of July, and on the right part is the European region, very, very similar epidemiological curve. Next slide. ICU pressure, on the other hand, appears. Here you see the hybrid immunity effect and the numbers of the estimated population to be affected by COVID, at least one, and these are early year numbers, March, April. And it was amazing that 75% of kids in the United States were already infected, and apparently hybrid immunity, the combination of natural and vaccine immunity, is a little bit better as far as immunological parameters. Next slide. What are our views on the future progress of the COVID pandemic and the need for an Omicron-adapted vaccine, and the same general theme, vaccine-induced versus natural immunity over time? Next slide. Omicron variants are very virulent and are spreading all around the world. This global spread will be associated with an increase in hospitalizations, and this is shown in this slide. Hospitalizations are rising in most of the countries with BA.5 spread. Next slide. ICU pressure, on the other hand, appears to remain low. And whether this is a result of less virulence with BA.5, as is the case with Omicron, the Omicron 1 variant, that was depicted in this elegant veteran administration study from the United States of America, we do not know. However, this study shows that people that were infected or were infected without or with booster, the left column is without booster, the right column is with booster, were significantly protected from the virus. Next slide. You see here 9.4% for moderate or severe disease with Omicron versus 14.2% moderate or severe disease with Delta for people without booster. And again, push the slide, please, the button. Next. And here you see come back please, one slide. 5.7% for those with booster versus 14.4% compared to Delta. This is an elegant study, 23,000 matched pairs by booster vaccination. And the question is whether we're going to see the same with BA.5. My sense is that we will see the same. Boosting vaccination patients will improve their outcome as far as moderate or severe disease. Next slide. Again, recent data, hybrid immunity, meaning infection with Omicron in previously vaccinated individuals protected better against known variants, whereas totally unvaccinated individuals with no exposure to the virus had quite low neutralizing immunity and were less likely to have cross-protection against previous SARS-CoV-2 variants. We should not forget this. So Omicron infection alone is not sufficient for protection. Next slide. Data from Qatar. Symptomatic infection on the left part, severe critical or fatal infection in the right part. What this data shows is that 3 doses of vaccine plus infection versus 3 doses of vaccine versus 3 doses of vaccine plus infection offers strong protection against death up to 97.8 to 100%. So if you combine this data and analyze them well, you'll see that 2 doses with infection, 3 doses, and 3 doses of vaccine and previous infection protect very well against severe disease. Next slide. CDC data, good efficacy of extra boosting dose in national data for all adults aged 50 years and above, where a second booster dose is recommended. Almost 14-fold higher protection against critical outcomes. So second booster works, and it's essential at this time point for high-risk individuals. Next slide. Thus, boosting with the effects of vaccine with extra doses seems a scientific way right now, and this was recently recommended by European Medicinal Agency and ECDC. Of course, use of an Omicron-adapted vaccine when available, and according to genomic, immunological, clinical, and epidemiological data, will broaden this immunity and may be better for high-risk population. I think we should go with what we have now for high-risk populations and examine the situation again in September with the adapted vaccines. Next slide. So you saw the voting 19-2 in the FDA in favor of strain update. There was this European Medicinal Agency statement. I think we need to be we should continue research on new vaccines that will have better immunogenicity profiles, prevent infection, and be widely acceptable. Next slide. There's the big question of funding, of equity in distribution, and whether we're going to use these new generation vaccines in the entire population versus the high-risk population that will get the most benefit. But still, benefit exists even in low-risk populations. Next slide. In Greece, approximately 40,000 deaths were averted with the vaccine used in our country. You see this in the left part of the slide, whereas the expected number of deaths without the vaccine is the purple curve, whereas the actual number of deaths is with the black curve. We estimated 80 to 90% protection with 3 doses at 6 months and 40,000 deaths prevented. Next and last slide. So, perspectives for summer 2022 and beyond. Several uncertainties exist. In conclusion, COVID-19 is here to stay. We expect to see some seasonality effects. Winter will likely be worse. Quality surveillance is necessary. We need to exploit new tools. Hybrid immunity will likely keep deaths down. And at the moment we have BA.5, but new variants are likely with the way the virus is evolving. Of course, the choices of the individuals versus society and the public fatigue does not permit us to institute any more measures. Risk communication remains crucial, but some damage has been already done. And the last slide. As I predict that the new test will be used and will likely become a part of our life, especially for other respiratory viruses as well, like influenza and RSV. And the last slide. Over the next few months, we're gradually returning to normality, of course, variant permitting. We will continue to see an endemic presence of the virus and possibly a new variant. People will relentlessly seek social opportunities. We should focus on protecting the high-risk population, the vulnerable, using the test-to-treat strategy. And, of course, we will perform a review of actions so far in order to identify gaps and perform corrective actions for the NHS. We plan this over the next couple of weeks with ECD assistance in Greece. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chodras. That was an interesting technique to say 3 times last slide. You went a little bit over time, but it was really very interesting. And for the ones, it went also very fast, I have to say. So I'll make sure that you all have the slides available. Mrs. Vliege, you have immediately the floor.
Okay, good morning, and good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's an honor for me to present some of the insights. Obviously, it will be. I will try to be as complimentary as possible to, but I concur very much to what my predecessor has been said. Next slide, please. And I will go through the same questions, obviously, but from the Belgian perspective, but obviously I think many of these perspectives are very, in a way, interoperable, but not always 100%. Next slide, please. So the evolution of the pandemic in Belgium. Next slide, please. We've had 6 waves so far. The first 2 very heavy, as you can see here from the number of patients admitted in hospital. And then we had somewhat lower waves, but nevertheless quite disruptive, as I will show you later. And we have, since some 2 weeks, the 7th wave started in Belgium. Next, please. When it comes to mortality, we had very severe mortality. I know there has been a lot of discussion on deaths and counting deaths. We can talk further about that because it's part of the discussion on how comparable international data are. Nevertheless, however, in one way or another, we have been very severely hit in Belgium due to several factors. And as you can see here on this mortality graph, over the first part of 2021, there's a serious decline in mortality, luckily, that we have observed, thanks to the upcoming of the vaccination. Nevertheless, with some additional increase again in over past winter and even until date, we still faced with something like 8-9 deaths a day, and if we do that every day, that counts a lot. Who is dying? It's obviously still mainly a mortal disease for the very elderly, but also not exclusively, as you can see also from the insert of the graph. Next, please.
And next to mortality, because mortality is not everything, even though it's significant and it's important, but what is worrying also very much is the huge impact on the healthcare system. I'm a hospital doctor, so I might be a bit biased there. And obviously, hospitals are like one canary in the coal mine of your healthcare system, but it's much broader than that. But if you can see here from this graph, the red lines showing occupied ICU beds for COVID, and the blue lines occupied ICU beds for non-COVID illnesses. And this green line, which is going right through the middle of the red bars, is the level that we usually use for non-COVID ICU care. And you can see that has been pushed down very severely at each wave, and that is the severe impact on the moment. So not having enough beds for all the non-COVID severe illness, which has a long-lasting effect for months and months to come. We've seen that in Belgium, but certainly also in many other countries. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I think what could have made the difference was to have a much higher sense of urgency right from the start, from January 2020, and not, I think that we have lost too much time in reassuring everybody that we were prepared, which we were not. So genuine pandemic preparedness plans were absolutely lacking, which needed to be regularly updated and written by multidisciplinary teams and regularly revisited, and that's, I think, in Belgium, the last revision of preparedness plans was 10 years ago, so that's not good enough. We lacked also a clear governance structure with clear command and control, as I would say, in a military-like. We absolutely lacked that, and we lost a lot of energy and time in that. Strategic stock of PPE. Where is the joint procurement program in all this? That was certainly in the early weeks, in the early months, a very, very difficult point. Clear infection prevention procedures, not only in hospitals, which had them to a certain extent, but underfunded, etc. But certainly in all other care settings, that could have saved lives. Certainly in the nursing care home settings, and more in a transversal way, better investments in indoor air quality, thinking of schools, for instance, and last but not least, investing in clear communication and sustained clear risk communication through various channels in many different ways, which includes indeed also debunking fake news. So that's for the first part, looking back a bit. Next, please. Then with regards to data, next, please. Also in Belgium, as in many other countries, we lacked a lot of data in the beginning. Here you see the increase of the number of tests, and only through the number of tests and the expansion of the testing possibilities, we gained insight gradually in what was going on. In the beginning, we had only a few data on hospitalized cases, but we had absolutely no idea on what was going on, and that has been going on until, let's say, May, June 2020. So that was really a challenge. Next, please. However, within Belgium, then gradually numerous sources of information have come together. It has taken a lot of time, nearly half a year or more, to connect all these data resources, to open them up also and that is until data, one of the challenges, to open up all data collections to all interested academic institutions, to connect and but what is even more challenging is interpreting these data. Next, please. So as you can see here, there's a wide variety of data streams, both from the medical field, but also, for instance, from occupational health, from travelers, from testing instances, from wastewater surveillance, etc. And so we've tried to come to some kind of very much coordinated surveillance system. Next, please. But one of the real challenges is that you generate data, and in the same time you generate that, you have to try and understand and make sense of it. Next, please. So often we saw data, and of course you can tell what you see, but it's very difficult to interpret then exactly what does that mean and how does that translate into policy advice. Hence, often we've really introduced the concept, which is very well known in science, advancing, progressing insights, and we are still learning as we go. If you ask me what will winter be like, we can give a little bit of forecast, but it remains also for us to be seen, and that is one of the major challenges here. We have to learn together as a society. Next, please. One part of data which is absolutely undervalued and is mental health data. On the one hand, there was a genuine lack of good assessments of the mental health status of the entire population, but also on very particular mental pathology data, and so that led to over and underestimation in the same time of mental health, of strong statements being made about suicide rates, which was not correct. On the other hand, also severe lack of correct data to feel really mental health status. Here you can see this is I think a very good attempt of already putting the finger on mental health by subsequent surveys made by my colleagues from the University of Antwerp, where you can see clearly that it's the young people, the younger generation, which is really suffering very much from the measures and from the entire situation. Next, please. Within the GEMS, we tried also to compile as much as possible the scarcely available data, so in order to give our decision makers as much as possible objective findings and objective data on the state of mental well-being and mental health among the Belgians, but certainly an important point of attention. Next, please. What have we learned? Well, we're still learning, but just on a nutshell. Next, please. First of all, on the pressure on the healthcare system. Here you can see the schedule which was developed by the Hospital and Transport Search Committee at the Federal Ministry of Health, where you can see that there is this stepwise expanding of beds allocated for in ICU and in hospitals allocated for COVID care, and we went from one phase into the other when cases came in, but that did not come without a price. Next, please. Next, please. As you can see here, already in the first wave or after the first wave, our fellow colleagues from the ICUs in Belgium objectivated the negative impact of an overflow of your ICUs that translates directly on in-hospital mortality, because you cannot give the same quality of care, and that's a no-brainer. But I think it's important to objectivate that, because that is really driving all the efforts to try and unload or spare hospitals so that they can continue to do their function, both for patients with COVID but also patients with all these other pathologies. Next, please. For those who are interested, the Kenny Centrum, so the Science Center, Center for Evidence-Based Policy, wrote an interesting and I think a well-nuanced report on the way how this hospital and transport search capacity was managed in Belgium. It might serve as inspiration. Next, please. But of course, when the pandemic evolved, we saw also all the countries started to vaccinate, and I believe as a country, we've achieved quite high levels of vaccination coverage, certainly for the basic schedule. Next, please. For the booster doses, we've been less convincing, less successful, and certainly also that there's still work to be done when it comes to protecting the real vulnerable populations, both socio-economically vulnerable. There's a lot of efforts have been done here in Brussels to try to reconnect with the socially vulnerable, but that has been a very difficult exercise so far with limited success. And on the other hand, the medically vulnerable, there is also still a way to go in offering the 4-dose second booster. Although we know that even with the second booster, these people are not 100% fully waterproof protected, but nevertheless, there's still room for improvement because this is the group that is still ending up in hospital in these Omicron waves. Next, please. Speaking of Omicron, what evolved as the pandemic evolved, vaccination took place, but also there was this consecutive appearance and disappearance of variants, and each with their own particular clinical impact. Right now, we are now at the BA5 has become dominant. And next, please. What we have observed is that, luckily, there is indeed this dislocation between the number of cases and the number of cases that require hospitalization. And you see a steep drop after Omicron has come in. So that is, in part, thanks to vaccination, but in part also thanks to intrinsic qualities, properties of the virus. That means, nobody knows what would happen if another more virulent virus would come up. So it's not a given that this would remain stable like this. Next, please. And same to the relationship between hospitalization and ICU. There has been some dislocation. Next, please. But that is not a given, so we should not assume that nothing can happen anymore with this healthcare sector. When looking ahead, next please. This is for Belgium the short-term prediction of hospitalization. So as you see, for the next few weeks, we expect to have each day about between 120 and 150 hospitalizations a day, and that puts an important strain again on hospitals, which are supposed to be in summer recess, whatever that may mean. Next, please. And even though there has, luckily, since January, this important dislocation or disconnection between the number of hospitalizations in the dark green and the number of ICU beds in the light green. So we have more patients in the regular hospital, and that capacity, of course, is more flexible. But nevertheless, next, please. What we observe is a very important absenteeism, both on the short term, as you can see, among healthcare workers, and next please, also on the mid-long term, about 12%, we are now above 12% of mid-long and long-term absenteeism among healthcare workers. So that's a mix of people becoming ill because of this Omicron, but also of the 2 years working in very difficult circumstances. So next, please. So one of the elements I think we need to think of really very well is what is this doing with our healthcare system? Can we really, for how long can we really closing and opening our healthcare system? This is something very new we've never done before, and we have to think very wisely how to make this system more sustainable. Next, please. And then last but not least, very challenging topic on COVID vaccination in children. Next, please, which I would like to open a little bit in the role of children, and I'll be very brief. There has been a lot of debate on the role of children in the different stages of this pandemic, and I believe, or not only believe, we have data to support that in the first and the second waves, children, and especially school-aged children, had a minor role, and where the epidemiology among children was following what was happening in society. But with the emergence of other variants, which were affecting much more also the younger generations, for instance, Alpha and later on Delta, we've seen that then this role changed. Moreover, because older generations, including the 18 plus and then the 12 plus in Belgium, got vaccinated. So we've seen last fall a switchover of Lex Police of school-aged children having a lot of suffering from a lot of outbreaks, and so as you can see here in the fall of last year, primary schools were really whether we like that or not, were really the driver of that epidemic. And the question is, how can you mitigate that? Because outbreaks in schools means also children out of school, means teachers out of school. Means all kinds of disruptions. So there are no 1,000 solutions in mitigating this, and you probably will require some kind of combination, whether or not at this stage, with this variant, Omicron, childhood vaccination is the most important role, whereas masks or air quality may play maybe more important roles. That is still a matter of debate. Next, please.
Where's your last slide?
Yeah, I think the last slide is a slide behind this one. Next, please. Next, please. Yes, I think that's my last slide. And that's a point I want to make. And I was very happy to see that also confirmed in the last night's WHO, the International Health Regulation Emergency Committee's new statement, where they say we have to go away from black and white concepts. It's not yet over. We require a lot of imperfect, nevertheless important measures. On the one hand, things that is on the individual base, but on the other hand also measures that are institutionally based. And so this is the famous Swiss cheese model: stay home when you're ill, get tested, be a part of contact tracing, wear a mask, especially when you're being close to vulnerable people, get vaccinated, but then also more transversally make sure that for instance, ventilation is in place, etc. So all these elements sum up, and we should go away from it's over or it's not yet over. No, it's not yet over. Things are getting better, but there will be difficult moments, probably in fall and winter, where we'll have partially to readopt certain measures, and there will be easier periods such as in summertime. But we have to think more in this kind of system and in gradual system, open and closing, and think very wisely how we do that and how we translate that very clearly in communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika. Sorry. Yeah, I thought it was very, very interesting. It's because it was so interesting that normally I'm a very, very chair who's always very much on time. Because, but I think it was interesting to let it go. You're the first two epidemiologists. Gives us a lot of, I think, interesting insight. For us, it's coming from all these different member states, sometimes interesting to see how it went in other countries and to make that comparison. Voilà. I now move to the questions and answers. It's a ping-pong method. You have 5 minutes overall with the answer. So people ask a question, you answer. So the question is 1.5 minutes. The answer can be 2 minutes, a half a minute follow-up question, and a minute answer. Okay. But I'm not going to. It's the first time that we do that. I'm not going to be extremely strict on that. The whole idea is you ask a question, and if you're not satisfied with the answer, in the sense, I wanted to know this or that, they can have a follow-up question. Mr. Kimporopoulos, please, you're the first. And please, sorry, can I say, if possible, please address to whom you ask the question.
Yes, of course. Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε, και καθηγητά Τζόιντρια και καθηγήτρια Βίλκε. Ευχαριστούμε πραγματικά θερμά για τις εξαιρετικές παρουσιάσεις σας, καθώς και για τον πολύτιμο χρόνο σας. Με χαρά σας υποδεχόμαστε σήμερα σε ένα χρονικό σημείο όπου ο αριθμός των κρουσμάτων αυξάνεται πανευρωπαϊκά. Η πανδημία COVID-19, όπως πολύ καλά τονίσατε, δεν έχει τελειώσει και οφείλουμε να διατηρήσουμε την επαγρύπνηση και την ετοιμότητά μας. Και φυσικά να κάνουμε το παν ώστε να προστατεύσουμε τη δημόσια υγεία, διατηρώντας παράλληλα την κοινωνία και την οικονομία ανοιχτές και ανθεκτικές. Και φυσικά
but also to leave our economies open. Of course, we can't waste time. You've shown us that
οι οποίες έρχονται. Γι' αυτό θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω και ο καθηγητής Σιόδρα τι άλλα βήματα ακόμη μπορούν να γίνουν σε ένα επίπεδο Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης στον τομέα της επιτήρησης των οξύων αναπνευστικών ασθενειών αλλά και την παρακολούθηση για την πιθανότητα ανάδειξης νέων μετανάσεων αλλά και επίσης αν υπάρχουν εξελίξεις σχετικά με την στρατηγική εμβολιασμού για την επερχόμενη περίοδο φθινοπόρου χειμώνα και την κυρία καθηγήτρια Γκλίγκε. Καταφέρατε να σας συγχαρώ που μέσα σε όλα βάζετε και τη ψυχική υγεία. Είναι πολύ σημαντικό να αναφέρουμε αυτό το τομέα. Αλλά ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω να σας κάνω μια ερώτηση σχετικά με ποια είναι και αν έχετε δει τα ιδιαίτερα χαρακτηριστικά των ανασακατασταλμένων ασθενών στα πλαίσια της γενικότερης αντιμετώπισης της πανδημίας. Προκαλώ σας ευχαριστώ και προσδοκώ σε μια επικοδομητική ανταλλαγή που θα αποτελέσει μια σημαντική βάση των συμπερασμάτων στα οποία καλείται να καταλήξει αυτή η επιτροπή.
Because these questions are essential for us so that we can reach conclusions for our report at the end of our work.
Okay, are you hearing me?
Yes, please. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm moving into the next phase of the upcoming winter. It's critical that the COVID-19 surveillance systems evolve to ensure all our member states continue to be able to make informed policy decisions. I think as we reduce comprehensive testing, it's important to ensure that limited public health and laboratory resources are invested optimally to meet key surveillance objectives. As the ECDC states, it's important to maintain in mind that SARS coronavirus 2 and evolving variants will most likely continue to circulate. New variants may emerge. At the same time, we need to have sustainability in our surveillance systems for not only COVID-19, but for influenza, respiratory syncytial virus, and other respiratory pathogens that constitute a pandemic threat. With regards to the strategies for the vaccination, I think the sad truth is that even getting 3/4 of the high-risk population to get a fourth shot with the original vaccine, we have failed. While the Omicron one is much closer to the Omicron 5 variant than the ancestral strain, it still has substantial similarities. And the question here is, should we wait for a BA5 booster? Should we use the Omicron BA1 booster that is being developed and clinically tested and has some initial results, and whether a delay that is exceedingly long and unacceptable will lead to more deaths and more lives being lost by the virus. I think there is no right answer. Variant chasing is an approach that has several flaws. By the time a booster having Omicron 5 is potentially available, I don't know what the next strain will be. So I think there is a vital need for new generation of vaccines that are universal, but also to the scientific guided use of the available vaccines for high-risk populations, and I concur with the decision by EMA and ECDC earlier this week to cover high-risk people.
Thank you very much. Mevrouw Vliegen.
Yes, thank you. With regards to special populations, we have, and I suppose you mean also medically vulnerable populations. So we, as a scientific committee, we have advised to focus in this stage, with this seventh wave, to focus first that we have, again, within our risk communication, have done all we can do to protect their health. That means trying to reach these people through patient organizations, through their specialists, through their GPs, through all kinds of caretakers, to stimulate people in need and to inform them about, nevertheless, the importance to have the second booster, about the importance to detect early disease and, where possible, treat with antivirals, for instance. That is also something which should expand much more to keep people at home while keeping an eye on them. But also then, in a second level, to responsibilize the circle around these vulnerable people, the partner, the relatives, the children, the home nurse, etc., so that they are also, as much as possible, protecting these people by wearing masks, by ensuring proper ventilation, by testing themselves regularly, by making sure they have all their recommended shots, etc. And then, if that would not be enough, if your wave is so big that it has a flow, an overflow in the general population, then of course general measures might need to be reconsidered. And again, I concur with the WHO statement that we should not really think in black and white there. It's not lockdown or no lockdown. That's not what we're talking about. It's rather about very pinpointed, fine-tuned measures, such as indeed improving ventilation, reducing densities, wearing masks in specific dense situations, etc.
Thank you very much. Is that okay?
I don't know if it was translated correctly, but I would like to give me, if you have any specific answer for immune-suppressed group of people. No, we know for in general, but I would like to know if you have specific measures for immune-suppressed.
Yes, well, this is, as you might know, the most challenging group, because exactly this is the group of people who do not always manage to have a very good immune response on their vaccines, even though what we measure is not what we measure in terms of antibodies is not always concurrent with the level of protection. So we still believe that vaccination in that group is still very important. But with close collaboration with their treating physicians, having very early detection of possible disease and early treatment with, for instance, Paxlovid or other antivirals could help. So it will be several building blocks of optimal protection. But it's true that this is a very vulnerable population, and we will have to work also through the ring around these people to protect them as much as possible, to do both.
Thank you very much. Mr. Luca, please.
Thank you, Chair, and also thank you to both speakers. And I totally sign what Mrs. van Bremt said. Was highly interested what you presented here today, and I'm very much concerned about long COVID. This is why I also want to connect my second question today to this, and specifically because we have in our title of the committee the lessons learned issue, and as Science Sano has presented a report on a study of COVID impact just very recently by the end of June, we had just to name a few percentages, 47% who have symptoms after the infection, still 32% after 6 months, and then it's only 23% who has the diagnosis received of long COVID after 6 months. So, and exactly what you said about the lack of data, and then bringing in the lessons learned issue right now. Do we underestimate this issue right now? Is it just the money, or is it the political will? What is it that we need to do right now to address this long COVID issue very correctly? That would be very interesting. Thank you.
That's a question to Mrs. Vliegen, I reckon.
Yeah. Well, I think thanks for your interest in long COVID. It's complicated, but that's of course a no-brainer. Long COVID. What do we need? Well, of course, money is always welcome because that helps to set up studies. But we need also time to follow up, and we need time, and we need very good and objective criteria. And a couple of months ago, the WHO issued tentative criteria. Because a lot of statements have been made on long COVID, both in the positive or in the negative sense. And to be honest, it's not clear to me whether we have been over or underestimating this phenomenon. The phenomenon we'd rather speak about post-COVID, but there's a lot to learn in the pathophysiology, certainly. We recognize this phenomenon from other viral infections, so there are similarities, but the differences as well. It's a new disease, so we have to learn much more, but we need much more data collections in all kinds of population, the least biased possible, because that's often a problem. You need long-term cohort studies to objectivate really these data, and not only surveys in very specific subgroups coming to your consultation, etc. So we need time, we need more cohort studies, long-term follow-up, and very accurately noting what are the complaints people exactly complain from. So I think we need a bit more time and very good and solid methodology to study this. And obviously, in the same time, a lot of trials have been started also to try and counteract, or to see how do we rehabilitate these people at best, and what can we learn, or can we use methods we use in, for instance, other linked phenomena such as fibromyalgia or post-infectious asthenia and the like, or not. So there's still a lot to learn also from these trials.
Is that fine, Mr. Lucke? Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Mrs. Triller-Lenoir, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Si vous me l'autorisez, comme je suis la seule représentante de RIM,
tu fais tout ensemble.
Voilà, je fais tout ensemble et ça me permettra de quitter la salle pour rejoindre une autre réunion. Merci beaucoup. Alors, je voudrais d'abord remercier nos deux collègues pour la clarté et la précision de leur travail, et à travers eux rendre hommage à tous les épidémiologistes européens qui ont tellement été en première ligne pendant cette crise. Nous sommes ici pour discuter de la vision européenne et pour tirer les leçons de la crise. Alors j'aurai des questions qui vont dans ce sens. Au début de la crise, la surveillance épidémiologique a souffert du manque de comparabilité des données et des indicateurs et de la faible interopérabilité des systèmes. Est-ce que les critères fournis par le CDC, les critères communs, vous ont permis d'améliorer l'harmonisation des données, et comment pouvons-nous aller plus loin? Dans les négociations sur mon rapport pour les menaces transfrontières graves pour la santé, nous avons proposé un réseau européen de laboratoires de référence, en particulier pour les tests diagnostiques. Je voudrais savoir quelles sont vos attentes par rapport à ce réseau. En termes de stratégie, je voudrais savoir si durant les trois phases successives de la crise, la phase de déploiement, la phase d'accalmie et la phase de chronicisation où nous sommes actuellement, vous avez défini des objectifs à votre stratégie. Est-ce que c'était zéro Covid? Est-ce que c'était diminuer la mortalité? Est-ce que c'était diminuer l'encombrement des hôpitaux? Est-ce que ces stratégies ont différé avant et après la vaccination? En termes de gouvernance, je voudrais savoir si vous considérez que votre gouvernement a bien pris en compte les recommandations des instances scientifiques. Je voudrais également savoir, vous avez un peu répondu, Madame, je ne l'ai pas entendu dans la première présentation, si vous avez pu évaluer l'impact de la crise sur la santé mentale et sur les maladies chroniques impactées, et comment vous imaginez qu'on puisse faire mieux à l'avenir pour protéger les plus vulnérables. Nous avons assisté à des fermetures de frontières, à des stratégies divergentes d'un pays à l'autre, même si on voit bien que les grandes lignes sont les mêmes, à des différences en termes de stratégie de testing, d'isolement. Est-ce que vous êtes informé du fait qu'il y avait durant cette crise un conseil scientifique européen. Si oui, est-ce que vous y avez participé? Sinon, est-ce que vous pensez que c'est une proposition importante? Et comment est-ce que vous définiriez la composition et les missions d'un conseil scientifique européen? Merci à tous les deux pour vos réponses.
I'm going to give the floor to Mrs. Vliege and then in addition to Mr. Tsiodras. Je m'excuse. Mrs. Vliege first.
I'll try to be concise. Thank you for interesting questions. Well, first of all, maybe in terms of data and criteria, common criteria as applied by ECDC. Yes, of course, all attempts to standardize case definitions, testing indications, and the like, that helps, certainly. Nevertheless, there are still a lot of data that are so region or country dependent. And for instance, when we look at with each variant, for instance, when the Alpha and the Delta variant came up, of course, one of the first things we wanted to know is how severe is it? How many people will need to be in hospital? How many people will require ICU care? But the indications to be sent to a hospital differ very much between countries. For instance, between the Netherlands and Belgium, there's an important difference in whether or not an 85-year-old person with COVID is going to be sent to a hospital, to an ICU, etc. So these differences are much more difficult to touch with standardization, and that hampers the interpretation of the severity of certain of a certain variant. So that's one thing. So standardization, yes, please, as much as possible. Certainly in surveillance, last summer and the summer before, with the European maps, with the travel maps, drove everybody crazy, because if as a country you did very well your best to do a lot of testing and to do good surveillance, that translated itself into a darker color on the map, right? So that's a bit counterproductive, and so we need to try as much as possible to standardize, but of course steering your testing policy and how people respond to that policy still remains a difficult matter. Then, in terms of the European Network on Diagnostic Tests, I'll be brief because that's not really my field, but I think also here, and it touches a bit your last question on a European Scientific Council. To be honest, we missed very much good and close collaboration on the scientific level. Obviously, all of us, we have our international partners, ad hoc partners from research collaboration groups. And at a certain point, we took initiatives with our counterparts, for instance, with our neighbors. When Alpha came on, when Delta came on, we invited people from the Netherlands, from Germany, from the UK, from Ireland, from France, to speak with us in a very informal manner to try and understand how are you guys dealing with this issue, how do you translate your data into advice, etc. That was very informal. But we lacked a very good and fast-acting structure. The GEMS, the European GEMS, I think we really need that in a much more formalized way. And I think how should that be composed? Well, that's a matter of debate. There's a lot of debate on how multidisciplinary that should be. It should be a workable format. And I think it would be already great to start with some delegates from the formal advice expert committees already in this kind. That would be already a step forward, not only in crisis time, but also in peacetime. I missed that also with Ebola, for instance. I was Ebola coordinator in Belgium in 2014, 2015. Also then we lacked really a very formal structure within Europe. So that's certainly something to work at. In terms of goals, The first goal was to avoid the healthcare system to be overburdened. That was the very first goal. Then the second goal that came fall 2020 was to keep the schools open as much as possible. And then in the slipstream of that, to keep the economy also open as much as possible. And obviously these three do not get along always very well. And now we feel that we have come also in a different state of play, whereas it is not only focusing on ICUs, but also the general functioning of the healthcare system with all this absenteeism and lack of energy, let's say, and resources to function, but also absenteeism to keep the economy open. So that, I think we've come in a new situation there, which might again require...
Okay, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Tsiodras to maybe complement.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I think there's lots of questions. Of course, lack of comparability of the indicators. We moved forward, and we still share data with the ECDC with regards to hospitalizations, ICU hospitalizations and deaths. And we focus more now on severe outcomes rather than cases. Initially, cases were coupled with severe outcomes. Now we see a significant decoupling, and I think that's important. So this definitely helped. Of course, you can't compare everything, and there's lots of regional differences within each country. With regards to age structure and vulnerability, so it's very important to realize this, and we cannot be comparable to each other at specific time points. So how can we go further? I think I alluded to this in my last couple of slides about the perspectives of the future. I think we need and that pertains to the entire population. We need to give greater visibility to vulnerable populations, but communicating specific information around the safety, access to free testing and test-to-treat strategy, especially for the high-risk population, is very important. Access to additional therapeutic options. I didn't mention our program on free distribution of the protease inhibitor in thousands of Greeks that were deemed to be high-risk with brilliant results, really statistically significant results as far as hospitalization and death, highly statistically significant results. I didn't have time to show this. Of course, mental health is very important. I agree with the speaker in the question. We in Greece, a deputy minister of mental health was appointed during the pandemic, and thousands of needs, of course, were out there. We established a continuous telephone line supporting for psychomental and social issues. It was a 10306 number. It was a standard number that was free for all, and it was supported specifically to answer questions about kids and adolescents. You know, there was lots of internet addiction and lots of effects on mental health. I cannot speak more about this. About impact of crisis and chronic diseases and delayed non-COVID care. This is important. I think this is changing as time passes by and we focus on non-COVID disease, but definitely left its footprint during the first phase of the pandemic. As far as goal changing, of course, I agree with my co-speaker from Belgium. Initially, mortality and burden of the NHS still is there. Still, we want to see fewer deaths and not a lot of burden to the NHS because it affects non-COVID care. At one stage, of course, maintaining education for the kids and having an open economy was important, and we used our scientific guidance to help guide policies.
Okay, thank you very much. Mrs. D'Amato.
Grazie Presidente. Partendo dal presupposto che i vaccini non prevengono l'infezione e i contagi, ma prevengono le conseguenze gravi, la morte, e che hanno una validità limitata nel tempo, e poi non sono, abbiamo continue varianti, quindi non abbiamo il vaccino adatto alle varianti che si susseguono sempre di più. Perché non spingiamo di più, anche a livello comunicativo, su abitudini, comportamenti legati a sani stili di vita, che in modo coerente riducono la mortalità da malattie infettive e la mortalità totale. Sono investimenti sostenibili da un punto di vista ambientale e a basso costo per i bilanci statali. Stiamo parlando di specifici interventi sulla qualità dell'aria, sulla sana alimentazione, sull'attività fisica, che in tempi brevi potrebbero ridurre i rischi di nuove infezioni pandemiche. Siete d'accordo su questo? E poi spingere ancora di più sui trattamenti, sulle cure. Qual è il miglior protocollo? Perché in Italia siamo ancora dinanzi alla vigile d'attesa e la tachipirina, e i medici che, conoscendo i propri pazienti, si azzardano ad uscire da questo protocollo, da questi limiti, sono anche accusati di andare contro la scienza e contro la medicina. Infine, sui bambini. In Danimarca un direttore del National Board of Health ammette che è un errore vaccinare i bambini. Su questo non c'è un'opinione scientifica univoca, mi pare di capire. E poi siamo dinanzi ad un nuovo anno scolastico, di nuovo distanziamento sociale, tra virgolette sociale, o asociale meglio, di nuovo mascherine imposte ai nostri ragazzi, con problematiche per il loro apprendimento, per il loro sviluppo in età evolutiva, per la loro socialità. Non sarebbe il caso di imporre o spingere il più possibile per una ventilazione meccanica delle aule, in modo che abbiano diritto anche loro ad una infanzia decente?
So that they could have a decent childhood.
Your question was to
both.
To both. Okay, but we don't have the time, please, colleagues.
Yeah, sure.
We don't have the time to have two answers every time because.
Sure. The first one for the doctor. The second about the children to Mrs. Velik.
Okay, Mr. Tsiodras, the first question is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. I couldn't agree more. We moved from a phase that vaccines prevented infections to a phase where vaccines are protective against deaths. We cannot oversee this. That's why I think it's important to emphasize this issue in risk communication, the death protection, especially for the high-risk population, with the booster dose, with what we have now. I couldn't agree more with the habits, the healthy lifestyle, the nutrition, the quality of our air. This has been shown repetitively to have significant effect in life promotion, in survival, and of course in avoiding infectious diseases. And we've seen that in several studies during this pandemic. Yes, I'm with you on that. As well as the treatment protocol. We have standardized treatment protocols. The European Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Disease Society has standard protocols. I was part of the guidance issuance. We can use available treatment to minimize risk for hospitalization and death, especially for our high-risk population. There's a question about using this medication in low-risk populations that still has not been answered, but right now it's very important to use this medication on high-risk people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mevrouw Vliegen.
Yes, with regards to what should be done with the children, I honestly think it is unjustified to say that it was a mistake to vaccinate children. It's rather the question: what is really helping to keep the schools open, to keep our children learning, etc. And again, as I pointed out before, it's still a question for all of us. I fully agree that investment on ventilation, on air quality, is one of the more crucial things we can do, and which should be pushed. But unfortunately, this will not be in place in all schools for next fall. So that remains still the problem. Of course, as long as we can keep the the pandemic under control with more general societal measures, that's one thing, but as soon as we see that there is major outbreaks in schools, then a good discussion needs to take place with all representatives, both from schools, from child rights organizations, but also among epidemiologists, as we have done repeatedly, and think, should we go then to a stepwise situation of very brief periods of using masks or distance learning, and in other moments invest much more in ventilation indeed. We might need a combination of all these, but on the long run, certainly investment in air quality is one of the best things we can do there, that's clear.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Joren.
Pardon. Madame la Présidente, tout d'abord, pour des fervents défenseurs de la diversité, je regrette qu'il n'y ait dans ces deux panels d'experts que des vaccinolâtres. Ce type de commission spéciale devrait être plurielle et représentative. Et avoir un avis critique, ce n'est pas de la désinformation, ça s'appelle la liberté d'opinion et de pensée, article 11 de la Déclaration des droits de l'homme. Alors ma question s'adresse à Madame Viguet. Moi je vais aller plus loin parce que c'est un sujet important, la vaccination des enfants. On ne peut pas rigoler avec ce sujet. Vous dirigez la stratégie Covid pour la Belgique et vous avez eu le courage dans le passé de déclarer qu'un vaccin ne fonctionne pas forcément pour toutes les classes d'âge. Beaucoup de parents d'enfants me contactent car ils ne comprennent pas la stratégie de la Commission qui met la pression sur les États pour injecter les enfants avec des doses Pfizer ou Moderna à la rentrée scolaire. La Commission, le 27 avril, déclare que les États membres de l'Union européenne devraient envisager de renforcer leurs efforts pour augmenter les taux de couverture vaccinale chez les jeunes enfants. Le Covid n'est pas dangereux pour les enfants. Je vous cite le CDC. La plupart des enfants ne développent pas de symptômes lorsqu'ils sont infectés par le virus ou ils développent une forme très légère de Covid-19. Bien que la transmission du SARS-CoV puisse se produire dans les écoles, les recherches montrent que la transmission dans les écoles n'a représenté qu'une faible proportion de tous les cas de Covid-19. Nous avons donc un bénéfice minime, voire nul pour les enfants. Quant aux risques, les effets indésirables sont parfois sévères et c'est insupportable. À ce jour, pour Pfizer, il y a plus de 33 000 cas d'effets secondaires répertoriés par l'EMA, dont 5 142 pour les enfants de moins de 12 ans. Un enfant de 13 ans aurait perdu la vue de 90% après une première dose de vaccin de Pfizer. Question. À partir de combien de cas d'effets secondaires répertoriés en Belgique ou en Europe, vous pensez qu'il est utile d'appliquer le principe de précaution et donc suspendre les injections sur les enfants? Considérant le caractère rassurant du variant Omicron et le fait que les vaccins actuels ciblent les formes anciennes du virus et n'ont pas permis d'empêcher la circulation dans la population générale, quel est le rapport bénéfice-risque estimé de la vaccination contre la Covid-19 chez les enfants à compter du 1er juillet 2022? Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Mevrouw Vliegen.
Maybe first of all, I would like to address, I'm not a vaccinologist, I'm an infectious diseases specialist, and so we have in our advice, we've always tried to balance very clearly the pros and the cons. Our group, expert group, was also not the national vaccination group, that was another group, but so there is a clear, I'm only describing the different advices that have been given. And you're right that in the large majority of children, COVID is fairly innocent, but not for all children. There has been this phenomenon of Miss C, which was not unimportant and for which we have observed, for instance, during the Delta wave, that vaccination was protective for this phenomenon. So we should not underestimate, and of course I acknowledge this is a small fraction of children, but it does exist. Clearly, studies on vaccination have been done with other variants and not with this Omicron. So with each variant, the situation may be different. That is true. And therefore the question of the schools remains very much on how to protect the schools. I do not agree with you that it is only a small fraction, that infection in schools is only a small fraction. I showed at a certain moment a slide where in October 2020 2021, the incidence in primary school children was 4 times higher, 4,000 per 100,000 population, as in the general population. And so we, unfortunately, we had to conclude that schools may play a very important role in fueling an epidemic, and maybe not so much for the children. So children are ill and have to remain at home. So that's one issue, but that's not per se always dramatic and severe. But it flows over to the rest of the population and the more vulnerable. And that is the tricky point.
Thank you very much. Meneer Roos, denk ik, voor ECR.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question to Mrs. Vliegen. Ordinary cloth mask or a medical mask will not prevent the spread of COVID-19 through airborne aerosols. People cough through that and people take off the mask to have a drink, and the effectiveness is very limited. Even FP2 masks are only provide protection for a very limited period of time. There are scientific publications about this. Nevertheless, masks became mandatory in Belgium at the beginning of the summer of 2020 in shops, cinemas and public transport, among other things. The decision was difficult. The psychological aspect was decisive. You then said many people feel that the epidemic is over. The obligation, therefore, does not come out of the blue. We think it's a good time to clearly remind that the virus is not gone. Minister Health Frank van der Broeke was even more explicit about the closure of so-called non-essential stores at the end of November 2020. He then explicitly said that shopping is not a great risk, but we had to create a psychological shock effect. My question is, how do you, as a chairman of GEMS, balance medical effectiveness and psychological factors? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mevrouw Vliegen.
Okay. Well, just very briefly, first about the effectiveness of masks. There is a lot of information, medical, scientific information that goes in all kinds of directions, but it is not. I think it is. The conclusion is not correct that they do not have any function. That is not true. They have a risk reduction, but obviously masks are typically not only measure implied, and so you always have to see in which circumstance and for which purpose you use them. But they do have their effect. Certainly, they are unpleasant, and therefore their use may need to be limited in time, and certainly on the long run, hopefully being replaced by very solid air quality investments. Now, coming back to the question on how to balance mental health care and physical health care, that's a very good question. We had numerous discussions among this, so there is no single right answer, but clearly we always have to weigh the impact of a certain measure, also the timeliness and the period during which you implement a certain measure. Having said that, when the risk is perceived, when there is a new wave, often there is an increased risk perception, and when we then surveyed people were often spontaneously motivated for that period to apply interventions and measures. Obviously, when these measures take a long time, people get bored and are annoyed by it. But it's not the case that there is the juxtaposition of the mental and the physical is often also a false juxtaposition. These two go together, and an outbreak where you do nothing, where you have no interventions, that is also damaging mental health. That is also that we have also data on that. So we have to think more flexible and add or decrease measures as they are needed in specific settings and circumstances.
Okay, but your own words was you said it was explicitly the psychological effect of the mask to remind people that the COVID was not gone. Okay, but you can reply. But I think that strategy worked, but only for a very short time. For a very short time, because in the long-term effect is that the people will less trust the government, or maybe not trust the government at all. There are people like this who are have really they have a really opposite position about the government because of all these psychological effects that is not really helping. Do you regret some decision or statement with the knowledge of now, and do you think that we should have done things in a differently in retrospect? If yes, what things would you have done different today? Thank you.
I'll ask Mr. Tsiodras to answer that question.
Yes, thank you. I was listening to the previous question as well. We wrote a paper in 2020 with a colleague, and what we said back then, I agree with the speaker, that guided by reliable surveillance data, distancing measures should be optimized down to the lowest sustainable level that guarantees a low and stable infection rate. We said it back then when infection rates were going together with morbidity in the hospital and mortality. It's changing now. So I would change that now to guarantees a low and stable hospitalization in ICU rate or death rate in order to keep societies open. Because we need to balance the wide-ranging negative effects on public health that the speaker alludes to. I think the qualitative mixture of the measures needs to be carefully optimized in order to minimize social costs. And I would say that at this point.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vliegen.
Very briefly, I would like to come back to the statement on the psychological effect of the masks. I think it is a wrong interpretation of statements from my side that the use of masks was done only for the psychological effect. That is not true. The reason why we advised it was because we had genuinely compiled sufficient evidence that these masks would be of additional help to decrease risks. In addition, of course, next to the physical protection, of course, when you see people around with masks, it does remind you of, there are still viruses circulating, but that was not the first reason, and I think I've never said such a thing that would be the first thing. Do we regret certain decisions? Obviously, we never took decisions. We gave advice, but do we regret certain advice? I think at the end of the first wave, when it became clear how severe the impact was on socially vulnerable people who even interpreted the measures even worse than they should have been. We kept playgrounds closed for a very long time. The open space, public space was closed for a very long time. I think there we should have been, or for next time, I think we should keep that in mind to have enough public space for everybody at all levels of society open.
Mr. Sokol.
Thank you very much. I have questions for Mr. Tsiodras. So first, what I would like to know is how is legally regulated the power to make concrete epidemiological decisions and decisions on obstacles in Greece. So, I mean, it's one thing are recommendations, but the other thing is who actually gets to decide, who has the power to decide about the actual limitations, obstacles, lockdowns, etc. And did you have any problems of constitutional nature, any kind of constitutional challenges about these decisions in terms of limiting human rights, free movement and things like that? So that's my first question. My second question is about vaccine hesitancy. Can you give me more information about the actual reasons, the causes of vaccine hesitancy in Greece? So what was the reason for those people who didn't get vaccinated? Do you have any data? What were the reasons behind that? If you can be more specific about that. And my third question is about, I don't know if you can answer this, but it would be great if you can give some information about the effects of all the measures, especially the healthcare sector, and the focus on COVID, so the effects of that on those patients suffering from non-communicable diseases. So I mean in terms of delay, postponements of checkups, diagnosis, etc. So how did the healthcare system in Greece adapt to this situation? What are these delays, and do you have any data about what will be the consequences of health on people, for instance, suffering from cancer who weren't able to get diagnostics and treatments at the right time? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chiotras, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
With regards to legal regulation and who takes the decisions, we never took the decisions. We were an advisory board of epidemiologists and clinical doctors and psychiatrists, mental health specialists, and people that specialize on analytical, epidemiological, and cost effectiveness. So the legal regulation was performed by the government, and the institution of measures was decided by the government. So we were always advising us. The speaker, the colleague from Belgium, said as well. I think this is what happened in most of the European Union. With regards to constitutional challenges, I think the mandate was an important thing. The vaccination mandate for those over the age of 60 that provided an extra 30% of those unvaccinated with an extra dose with the primary regimen of the vaccination, and the obligation of vaccination in healthcare workers in the hospital, that was constitutionally challenged, and apparently the Supreme Court has voted in favor of both. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know the legal issues very well, but I know that the Supreme Court of Greece voted in favor of both mandates that were instituted in the country for the obligatory vaccination in healthcare workers against COVID, and the mandate for those over 60 that has now dropped. But this was, of course, as you can realize, a very, very sensitive issue and created lots of political tension and discussions in the society. As far as vaccine hesitancy and vaccine intention, I think we did several studies, and in multivariant analysis, unwillingness and or uncertainty to get vaccinated was associated with younger age, with lower educational level, and concerns about vaccine efficacy declined with the implementation, the wide implementation of vaccination. So at the beginning was different reasons, new vaccine, new technology. We don't know enough about it as it became clear, at least for the initial phase of the vaccine campaign, that it was protective, 95% protective for infection and 99 to 100% protective against death. People were willing to be vaccinated. This changed, and I would like to highlight here the risk communication issue. As variants came on board and the efficacy for prevention of infection changed, we retained the vast majority of the effect against mortality, but it's very difficult to explain, and you need simple words to answer simple questions to the people, and this, I think, is something that we could have done better as a society, both in Greece and at the European level. Of course, studies evaluating vaccine hesitancy speak about vaccine safety as the first issue all over the world and in Greece as well. As regards to the delayed non-COVID associated care, this happened in our country, especially during the lockdown, and it was not only because of the system not working or being pushed by COVID, it was also because of people's fear to approach hospital systems. This is something we need to work on. This is a very important gap identified during this response to this pandemic. So we need to provide non-COVID or non-pandemic care during pandemic crisis situation, which is extremely difficult, but we need to work more on this.
Thank you very much.
Just a short follow-up. So what was the role of the overall trust or lack of trust in institutions for vaccine hesitancy? So did this play a part? Thanks.
I think the trust is always the biggest in studies we have done in the Greek population in the personal doctor, not in the institution per se or the government organization that issues guidance. It's extremely high in the government organization issuing the guidance. It's close to 80%, but this leaves out the 20% of the population that's not covered, and it goes together with the initial coverage of the population that was higher than expected, to be honest, close to 85%, and then dropped down for the booster dose to 65 to 70%. But those numbers go together. People tend to trust their personal physician, and I think more work needs to be done to the personal physician communication with the patient rather to the government or organizational trust. We need to build trust in organizations, but people tend to trust more their close environment.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kloene. Mrs. Kloene.
And thank you for, there's a lot of information there, and I think the point is going to make, Mrs. Verheugen, I really I'm listening clearly when you said that there was a lack of urgency at the beginning and no clear governance, which I think they're very strong lessons that we can learn from that. I think that's really important. Thank you. I'd just like to ask about the current situation, particularly, the current, and Belgium as well. Belgium being, a country that would have lots of travel in and out. Did you find that was different? That there was need to restrict movement cross-border? Did you recommend that? I'm thinking of, particularly I come from Ireland, where we're an isolated country, so we were able to shut down, completely lock ourselves down, which was, there was for and against, and there was a lot of controversy around that too, we won't go there. Did you think that type of information was useful? And also, if you could give some insight into where we are today in terms of dealing with pandemics, and I'm thinking really about isolation, restricting movements. That you think that's still going? That's important. That type of recommendation, because we see now with tourism sector, travel, it's to get. There's a lot of people off work, and is it absolutely? I'm sure it is important, but looking forward, if we're going to face another wave in the autumn, are we going to have? Is that going to live with that type of reality?
Mevrouw Vliegen.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, indeed, Belgium is a country with a lot of borders. That's true, and that is one of our weaknesses. We are one of our strengths economically, but also weaknesses. And I know I'm here in the heart of the European Parliament, so and that went against a lot of this philosophy of closing borders. However, I myself have pleaded in the early phases of the pandemic to close the border with our neighbours, and I know that from a political point of view that was super difficult, but we cannot deny the epidemiological reality that va-et-vient, so that the traffic of people and travelling of people comes along with an increased infection risk. That is still the case until date. By the end of the summer, we know that there will be a lot of people coming back from all corners of Europe and beyond Europe, whatever that may mean for the introduction of new variants. We knew that closing the borders was something that is very short-lived and is not sustainable. On the other hand, in very deep crises, such as in the beginning of this pandemic, I think it has helped to keep the effect of lockdowns. But it's very ambiguous. That's clear, and it's not something that you can sustain in a normal democratic country for a long time. That's absolutely clear. So, having said that, we have to keep in mind that tourism remains a source of spread of viruses, and not only, for instance, COVID, but also monkeypox could be. So we have to warn and to inform everybody who's going to travel, and the way how travel takes place should also be, or could also be, safer. And again, thinking of people cramped in an airplane without proper ventilation or without masks may be an issue, may be a difficulty. So, border closing is a last resort measure, I would say. Makes sense from an epidemiological point of view, but obviously we understand very well it is in juxtaposition with political philosophy, clearly.
Thank you very much. That's okay.
Just on dealing with just isolation and recommending that people who have COVID would isolate. Do you still recommend that, and do you think that's important? And is it 7 days, 5 days? Can there be flexibility? Not flexibility now, but is that evolving, that position?
Yeah. Yes. That's a good question indeed. Yes, when you are ill, the advice is, that has not changed. The advice is withdraw yourself from society and from close contacts with other people, and that is something you can do relatively easy yourself. Now that we have the habit of the flexibility also in teleworking, telemeetings, etc., so that remains important. In terms of duration, that varies, and these insights vary also. Some variants may, and some people may have longer shedding of virus than others, so we have to draw some kind of median there. But again, there is a difference between the scientific idea, where we know that probably 10 days is necessary to not to be fully contagious anymore, whereas feasibility in the society predicts that this is not going to be feasible. And of course, the first days are probably the most contagious. So again, you have to marry there what is acceptable society-wise and what makes sense from a scientific point of view. Not easy.
Thank you very much. Mevrouw Fransen. Dank u wel, voorzitter. Ik zal in het Nederlands spreken. In elk geval bedankt aan de twee sprekers voor de ontzettend boeiende toelichtingen. En ook speciaal naar professor Vliegen. Dank u wel voor al het geleverde werk en bij uitbreiding uiteraard ook de zorg- en gezondheidssector. En u verwees er al naar het begin van de 7e golf. Is ook in aantocht het recht op verlof, ook voor de zorgsector, die reeds 2 jaar het beste van zichzelf geeft. En laat ons eerlijk zijn, reeds voor corona zat de sector reeds op haar tandvlees. En daartegenover staat dan uiteraard de motivatiemoeheid van de burgers om de maatregelen nog te volgen. En in België hebben wij gebruik gemaakt van de motivatiebarometer, om de politici te helpen bij het bepalen van welke maatregelen op welk moment opportun is om de opgang van het coronavirus in te dijken. Studies tonen ook duidelijk aan dat er verband is tussen het moment waarop maatregelen genomen worden, hoe deze worden overgebracht aan het brede publiek en de motivatie van de burgers om de regels na te leven. We zagen bijvoorbeeld ook dat politici soms terughoudend waren om strengere maatregelen af te kondigen uit angst voor reactie bij de burgers en eventuele demotivatie. Vandaar een aantal vragen rond die motivatiebarometer. Is er een verband tussen de strengheid van de regels en de motivatie om mensen om deze te gaan volgen? Wat is de meerwaarde van het gebruik van deze coronabarometer? Ziet u ook een verschil in motivatie of mentaal welzijn bij de bevolking tussen landen die wel gebruik maken van een barometer en landen die dit niet doen? En kan dit op Europees niveau functioneren? Geeft het volgens u een toegevoegde waarde om dit soort beslissingen ook op Europees niveau te kunnen nemen? En dan een tweede vraag. U had het over het absenteïsme. Hoe kunnen wij als Europese Unie en de sector, ik heb onlangs ook met de sector samengezeten, wat kunnen wij als Europese Unie meer doen om de continuïteit van de zorg, het is een probleem, in de lidstaten te helpen garanderen? Tot zover mijn vragen. Mevrouw Vliegen. U mag helemaal in het Nederlands antwoorden.
Ja, dank u wel. Eerst misschien over de motivatiebarometer. Laat me misschien toch even verhelderen. Dat is geen officieel beleidsinstrument geweest.
geweest. Dat is eigenlijk een studie-instrument. Dus dat bestaat bij mijn weten eigenlijk alleen maar in die hoedanigheid in België en vooral in Vlaanderen, want dat was een initiatief van de onderzoeksgroep van Maarten van Steenkisten. Dus dat wil zeggen, eigenlijk weten we niet goed of dat extrapoleerbaar is naar andere landen, want we hebben zeer weinig gegevens eigenlijk over mentale gezondheid in andere landen. Of die zijn ook opnieuw niet makkelijk interpreteerbaar en ik denk dat je moet rekening houden met zeer sterke echt interculturele verschillen. Want waarover gaat het? Die motivatiebarometer die heeft eigenlijk op herhaalde momenten bevragingen gedaan aan een hopelijk zo representatief mogelijke groep van de bevolking. Al is dat altijd moeilijk, want je zit altijd met een bias van de mensen die bereid zijn om die vragen te beantwoorden enzovoort. Maar goed, bevragingen naar welzijn, naar welbevinden, naar autonomie en dergelijke. En wat we daar onder andere uitgeleerd hebben is dat, zoals ik daar straks ook al zei, op het moment dat de risicoperceptie omhoog gaat, dat mensen rondom zich mensen ziek zien worden, dat mensen eigenlijk terug ongerust worden, dat er alarmtekens zijn vanuit de ziekenhuis, dat de motivatie ook terug stijgt om bepaalde maatregelen aan te nemen voor en dat is dus niet altijd zo dat er geen draagvlak is. Dat was ook wel een beetje onze discussie vaak. Je moet interventies om effectief te zijn, die moet je vroeg nemen, op het moment dat je het ziet aankomen, maar onder het mom van het draagvlak, er is geen draagvlak in de populatie, werd er vaak heel lang gewacht, totdat dan het kalf half verdronken was en je eigenlijk een hele lange piek hebt enzovoort. En eigenlijk is onze motivatie altijd om dat te vervroegen. Maar dus een aantal dat soort dynamieken, de connectie tussen risicoperceptie, motivatie om maatregelen te volgen en vertrouwen in je politiek is heel erg verschillend van land tot land en van cultuur tot cultuur. Dus dat is toch nog subject to further study, denk ik.
We should study that further. Dank je wel. Mrs. Anderson, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Basically, I have a question regarding, the follow the science. If it is about following the science, and it was said here that people didn't trust the scientists anymore, they didn't trust government anymore, but can you really blame people? Because we had this absurd situation here in the House that the mandatory masks, they fell, a couple of weeks or a few weeks back, but in Belgium, all of the restrictions fell in May of last year. So we had this absurd situation that we ran around in this house wearing masks because of this deadly virus. And then we left the house, went across the street to Place Luxembourg, and then we sat all together and shared a meal and sitting rather closely. So if it is about following the science, shouldn't apply science everywhere and at every time and to all people, not depending on where you are. For instance, in Germany, you cannot ride a train without wearing a mask, but once you reach the Belgian border, it's all good. So apparently the virus got off the train on the last stop in Germany. So people are not trusting you anymore, and I can see why they are not doing that. And finally, I would like to, are you familiar with the Fogan effect? And I would like you to elaborate on that. Basically, there was a study done, peer-reviewed, that once a person has been had contracted the virus and continues to wear the masks, it will lead to a statistically significant increase of severe courses, hospitalization, and even more deaths. So are you familiar with that? And could you please elaborate on that and maybe give an explanation as to why that is? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I presume that was to Mrs. Vliege, your question? That question was to Mrs. Vliege or Mr. Tsiodras?
If both could answer, please.
I'll try, but we don't have the time for that in the ping-pong method. It doesn't work like that. But Mrs. Vliege and then to Mr. Tsiodras, if you can be really very brief.
Sure, I'll be very brief in terms of follow the science. I think science is not, again, it's not a black or white thing. It's evolving insights. It is data that we interpret with different methods, and there may be different readings. That is happening all the time, also in outside pandemic times. That's what we do as scientists. We have discussions. The difficulty now in a health crisis is that you have no time to see how things are going to evolve. So you need to take a certain decision or a certain analysis, which may be changed over time. And some people are more cautious. Other people are a bit more liberal. I mean, there is difference between scientists and between the interpretation of scientists. That's completely normal. However, I still believe that in 80–85% of the interpretation of findings and data, the large majority of scientists have common insights, so it's not that it goes in all directions, scientific interpretation and scientific advice, I think, has relatively been concurrent in many member states. But then the difference is how that is being translated into policy, which is then also where other influences such as pragmatism, personal opinions of policymakers, etc., play also a role. So, and you have to make a clear decision between what has been advised and then which decisions have been taken, more or less cautious. Secondly, from that famous motivation barometer, it came out that, it is not the case that people do not trust scientists anymore. At least I can speak only from the figures from Flanders. It's the other way around. It is the highest trust was in the own GP and own caretakers and scientific experts, much more, I'm sorry, than policymakers.
I'm afraid that is exactly the case. I first go to Mr. Tsiodras, please.
Yes, I would like to say that science should guide us. Lack of consistency in messaging about science is, of course, not helping with public health measures. With regards to the Fogan effect that you mentioned, of course, it's a mathematical modeling exercise, again, based on in vitro data. And I think what we need to understand that for public health interventions, they are facilitated by pre-specification of effect size, by the greater use of data standards. And for masks, we have big population studies from Denmark, from Canada, and from elsewhere showing the beneficial effect of masks. If there is a number of recommendations that are made whilst noting that progress is made in some areas and that science evolves, I acknowledge that, and we need to examine that. And we're not saying no to science. We concur with what you're alluding to, that we should move together with science. But right now, there's no population evidence in a real-life situation verifying this effect. We will wait and see. But however, there is evidence on the protection of masks, especially for the first phase of the pandemic. But remember that we made recommendations noting that progress is being made. And this is true for vaccines, for masks, and for what other measure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 30 seconds, sir.
Yeah, just a brief follow-up. So what I was actually getting at was, there is the science, but the restrictions that were imposed on the people, they simply did not make any sense. And I would like to maybe come up with a solution for this, because it's not reasonable for people sitting in this house wearing masks and leaving the house across the street, and then no masks are required anymore. How do you explain this to people if you want them to adhere to these restrictions?
We will have, hopefully, health ministers in September. Maybe that's more of a question for policymakers than for our scientists.
Yeah, I agree.
The last on my list is Madame de la Pizza.
Muchas gracias, señora Fliege, señor Tsiodras, por sus aportaciones. Como ven, hemos echado los diputados mucho en falta este tipo de análisis, ¿no? Es nuestra responsabilidad hacer preguntas y esto pues no debe suponer un señalamiento o una categorización política tan señalada. porque nuestra intención debe ser esclarecer y dar seguridad. Tal y como hemos comentado, es verdad que de alguna manera seguimos a ciegas, ¿no?, por la escasa y la baja calidad en la recogida de datos, ¿no? Y usted ha subrayado la necesidad de poner recursos en ello. ¿Por qué se ponen todos los recursos solamente en la línea de investigación de las vacunas y no en otros ámbitos? No se está dando seguimiento a la evolución de los pacientes que han sufrido la enfermedad. Ya se ha hablado aquí del long COVID, pero también están los efectos secundarios a largo plazo, tanto de la enfermedad como de las vacunas. Necesitamos estudios serios. Ya hay índices llamativos y preocupantes, como el descenso de la fertilidad. En Alemania, 9 puntos por debajo de lo esperado, o aumentos de la mortalidad sin poderlos atribuir al COVID. ¿A usted le preocupan también estos índices? Por otro lado, pregunta al señor Siotras. Ha hablado usted hoy de hybrid immunity, inmunidad híbrida, como algo más eficaz. ¿Me puede explicar cuál es la razón, ¿no? Si la vacuna ya nos expone a un tipo de proteína que está presente en el virus y la enfermedad, al virus completo, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué nos da una mayor eficacia, ¿no? Los laboratorios, de hecho, indican retrasar la vacunación hasta que pasen unos meses después de la enfermedad. Habla del desarrollo bajo de la inmunidad por Omicron. ¿Esto tiene que ver con la severidad con la que se padece la enfermedad? ¿Por qué? ¿Por qué los test de anticuerpos no se utilizan para evaluar la inmunidad adquirida, bien natural o artificial? Sería oportuno conocer la evolución de los diferentes tipos de inmunoglobulinas, la G, la IgG, la IgM, la IgA, y cómo funciona su reactivación con nuevos contactos. ¿No cree que se debería investigar más en conocer la inmunidad natural frente al COVID y cada una de sus variantes? También cómo afecta a cada tipo de paciente, conocer los factores de predisposición para poder sufrir un cuadro grave de la enfermedad y por qué ocurre.
Thank you very much. Mevrouw Vliegen.
Apologies. Yeah, regarding the follow-up studies. So I, certainly I agree with you that it is super important to follow up also long-term effects of everything that has happened, of how, on the one hand, a follow-up, as I said earlier, very well-designed cohort studies, population-based studies, so not only one subpopulation, but cohort studies where you really take an entire population cohort, where you follow up effects of disease and potential long-term effects of vaccination. I think that is what always happens, a long-term follow-up, post-manufacturing surveillance. That is part of the process. And here, of course, a lot of things happened together. You had the virus, you had the pandemic, you had measures, and you had vaccination. So all these. So I fully agree that we need more epidemiological studies. So funding also for long-term follow-up. Also to. I'm personally not extremely worried, but I think it is only normal that we study this. So to objectivate what do we see, because if you don't study, you won't know. That is clear.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chiodras, for your last answer. Aha.
Sir, you might have forgotten to press on the speak button.
I'm sorry. So we need more scientific data. We know for a fact that BA5 and BA4, BA5 is the more prominent now, do not only change as the virus evolved in the spike area of the virus, but in other areas of the virus as well. And this explains the immune escape, as we said, from previous vaccines. And it's important to understand that it may escape as far as B-cell immunity, which means antibodies, neutralizing antibodies against the virus that prevents you from getting the infection, with T-cell immunity that protects you from dying. And this is the rationale behind the decisions about providing the booster dose to those at the highest risk right now. With regards to what that means for vaccinology, of course, we need to develop new generation vaccines that will take care of these scientific issues, and will try to address the question of clinical efficacy in the clinical trial and effectiveness in the real-life scenario against infection and death. We want a vaccine that prevents against infection. We may not have that because the virus is evolving, but we may have it in the future. Nasal vaccines, for example, that are used in the nose and that are inhaled may provide a better protection. We need new generation vaccines. We need more studies on those new generation vaccines. With regards to hybrid immunity and the effects that the previous infection has, we know that this acts in synergy with vaccination, and we know that for a fact for the Omicron variant, and this has been proven in scientific publications. We do not know that for the BA.5 variant. We expect publications about that. Why does that hold true so far? I think it's because of what all of us are thinking. It's because you're exposed to the whole virus. Vaccination is part of the virus. It mobilizes your immunity, but the virus is changing, and you're exposed to a slightly different virus variant over the ages, over the last 1.5 years, and you create a broader repertoire of cells responding to the virus. We need more studies in that, but I think this is what's happening now, actually. This is what we're seeing now.
Thank you very much, and that concludes the session of today, because we already exceeded our time. Thank you very much, both experts from Greece and Belgium, for, I think, an excellent hearing, and for your openness to answer all these questions. And I see you, colleagues, in the afternoon for the next panels. The next panel, the epidemiologists coming from France, Portugal, and Austria, right? See you this afternoon, 2:30. Thank you very much. Have a nice lunch.